Hello, fellow sapiens, and welcome to Midnight Sapien. Whether you're walking beneath cold city lights, curled up under wool blankets, or spiraling softly towards sleep, this space is for you. Because tonight, we journey into the untold history of food itself. How ancient humans survived without farming, without fridges, and without the modern miracle of storage. This is calm storytelling for hungry minds. It is the forgotten story of survival, across tens of thousands of years, shaped by silence, stone, and the need to eat before the cold arrived. But it is not the crude tale of meat and berries you may have imagined. No, the truth is more intelligent, more intimate, and far stranger. And you know, if you're the kind of human who enjoys long-form prehistoric mysteries, poetic science, and storytelling that takes its time, consider tapping like and subscribe. It helps these slow stories reach other curious sapiens out there. Also, what time is it for you, right now? And where in the world are you listening from? If you feel like sharing, leave a comment. Just a quiet reminder that we are all listening together. Oh, and you're completely allowed to fall asleep. The timestamps are in the description if you ever want to find your way back. Now, we begin with the warmth inside a broken bone. Before there were ovens or harvests, before there was bread or broth or even fire rings tucked against rock walls, there was marrow. Deep within frozen bones, marrow waited soft, fat-rich, immune to decay for a short, vital window. It was not abundance. It was the last fallback, when the hunt failed, when meat rotted too fast, when skin stretched tight against ribs, and every footstep meant a choice between burning energy and saving it. Marrow became the food that saved human life from vanishing into the cold. No one farms a mammoth. No one cages a reindeer. There were no granaries, no fridges, no herds waiting beyond the next ridge. In the Ice Age, food was movement. Survival meant constant recalibration between hunger and energy, effort and risk. Fat was not just a bonus. It was the real currency of life. Without it, muscles meant nothing. You could be strong and still die in the cold. Because heat slips from the body with every breath, and no strength can bring it back once it's gone. Fat, not muscle, was the shield, and the bones held it best. So imagine this. A band of humans clustered around a fallen beast, the soft tissue already carved away, the meat already roasted or drying in strips. What remains are bones, thick and heavy femurs, tibiae, even teeth. And now comes the second act. Not waste, but precision. Stones sharpened not for slicing, but for cracking. The bone must be split cleanly, decisively because time is short and warmth is fading. A poor break spills the marrow into the dirt. A clean one reveals a gleaming, pale core, the stored sun of the animal's life, now transferred to human hands. It wasn't a feast, it was survival math. And over generations, this act became more than reaction. It became skill. There are fracture marks on bones, tens of thousands of years old spiral cracks that show intent, not accident. We see the wear on hammerstones, the polish on anvils, the patterns of impact that repeat across continents and eras. The same behavior appears in Neanderthal camps, Homo sapiens shelters, even sites of Homo heidelbergensis. This was not a regional quirk, it was a species-wide adaptation, and it tells us something deeper than technique. It reveals a kind of knowledge passed not in words, but in action. You do not learn how to crack a femur from instinct. You learn it by watching, by failing, by swinging a rock and seeing the bone glance, then swinging again and seeing it split. It is a ritual of precision disguised as a brute act. One mistake, and the marrow is lost. What does it mean that such care was given to a thing so hidden? That inside the hardest material of the body, encased in the thickest bone, lay the most vital reward? And how did early humans come to know it was there at all? Perhaps it began with the observation of scavengers. Hyenas and wolves often gnawed at bones long after flesh was gone, crunching through to get at something inside. Or perhaps it came through desperation, a final attempt, when all other parts had been consumed, and hunger still remained. However it began, once learned, it was never forgotten, because the reward was too great and the need too constant. In Marrow, Ice Age humans found something rare, a calorie-dense, nutrient-rich resource that could be stored, accessed, and consumed with no need for fire, salt, or tools beyond a sharp rock and a steady hand. The act of extracting marrow became a shared rhythm. It happened at kill sites, at campfires, at sheltered rock overhangs, and we see it in the archaeological record. Broken long bones clustered in rings, hammerstones nearby, some bones cracked with precision, others messier, maybe the work of a child or someone learning. In some sites, marrow-rich bones were deliberately stored for later. In others, they were the last things touched, the emergency reserve. It was food not just for the body, but for the mind, a psychological buffer against starvation. To know that bones remained meant hope remained. There was still something to fall back on. It is easy now, in a world of full cupboards and climate control, to overlook the central role of fat. But coal does not negotiate. It strips heat from the skin, drains the muscles, and makes every movement a gamble. In such a world, fat is life. It fuels the brain. It cushions the nerves. It helps the body retain warmth. Muscle, for all its strength, burns fast. It gives energy, but not endurance. Fat, by contrast, burns slowly, richly, and deeply. It sustains. And so, when humans cracked bones, they weren't just eating, they were insulating themselves from death. This is why marrow mattered more than meat. It is why we find cut marks and percussion fractures even on the smallest of bones, from deer, from birds, even from rodents. It wasn't just about size. It was about access. In some camps, bones were boiled in pits to release grease. In others, they were pounded into paste, mixed with dried meat, and stored as a kind of Ice Age ration. Every scrap of fat was saved. There was no luxury in waste. To live in the Ice Age was to live close to the edge of caloric collapse. One failed hunt could mean days without replenishment, but bones lingered. They did not spoil as fast as meat. They could be hidden from scavengers. They could be carried short distances. In them, early humans found a kind of insurance not against death itself, but against the immediacy of it. When you cracked open a bone, you were not just eating. You were buying time. Time to find more food. Time to stay warm. Time to survive the night. And that was often the real measure of success, not how much was gathered, but whether it lasted until morning. A cracked femur under frost, protected by bark or hidden in a snowbank, was not just a leftover. It was a decision. A quiet, calculated step in a long chain of survival acts. Early humans did not eat all at once. They rationed, they cached, they shared. Not because they were sentimental, but because they understood cycles of hunger, of hunting luck, of weather that could turn from bearable to lethal in a single gust of wind. We can imagine the sounds, the rhythmic clack of stone on bone, the sudden snap of a successful fracture, the soft exhale of breath in cold air as marrow is scooped out with a stick or licked straight from the split. Children watching, elders remembering the last time they went 2 days without food. These were not grand feasts. They were intimate, necessary moments of attention. To crack a bone correctly took practice. Too much force, and it shattered. Too little, and it resisted. The aim was always the same: to open, not destroy. And marrow itself was strange. Not meat, not liquid, not quite solid. It came in many forms: firm in some animals, oily in others, yellow with stored fat, red when more blood remained. Each had its own value. Each taught something about the animal, the season, the recent weather. Knowledge wasn't just about where to hunt. It extended into the body of the prey. You learned what kind of marrow meant a healthy animal. You learned what kind meant it was starving, and maybe so were you. This kind of food didn't come wrapped or labeled. It required interpretation. And in that process, cognition deepened. The brain began to associate tools with outcomes. Stones became not just weapons, but utensils. Actions developed sequences. Crack, pry, taste, store. What had once been a chaotic scramble for calories became a method, a craft. A system passed down not by instruction, but through repetition. There is something revealing in the consistency of it all. From Spain to Siberia, from the caves of the Neanderthals to the open plains of Homo erectus, we see the same marks. Spiral fractures, percussion points, bones split at just the right angle. This wasn't isolated behavior, it was human behavior. Which means it was probably emotional too. The satisfaction of a clean break. The comfort of the rich taste on a freezing morning. The relief of feeding someone else. These acts weren't always spoken, but they mattered, because marrow, in the end, was more than food. It was knowledge made edible. It was survival, compressed into a gesture, one that could be taught, remembered, repeated. And in the Ice Age, that was everything. Not just what you killed, but what you knew to do afterward. Not just the hunt, but the afterlife of the bones. Because once the marrow was drawn and the fat consumed, the bone still had value. It could be reshaped into tools, flaked into points, or sharpened into awls. And this reuse shows us something profound, that even in times of scarcity, nothing was treated as trash. The marrow fed the body. The leftover bone fed the hand. It was an unspoken ethic of efficiency, one born not from philosophy, but from need. At some sites, long after the flesh was stripped, we find bones with deliberate incisions, grooves likely made while prying marrow, but sometimes etched with marks that go beyond utility. Could it be memory? Could the act of marrow harvesting become linked to something more than hunger? A symbol, perhaps, of life's fragility, that deep inside the hard, dead exterior, something soft and vital still remained. It's speculation, but humans are meaning-making creatures. Even the most physical acts can become layered with thought. What is not speculation is the biological consequence. Populations that learned how to prioritize fat survived more reliably in glacial climates. Those that relied solely on muscle meat ran into problems. Lean protein, consumed in high quantities without enough fat, leads to what modern physiologists call rabbit starvation, a condition where the body burns more energy processing the protein than it gains. It results in weakness, nausea, and ultimately death if not corrected. Fat solved this. Marrow was one of the few accessible, storable forms of fat in a world where plants were rare and nuts seasonal, and it was portable. In later periods, marrow, or extracted bone grease, would be combined with dried meat and berries to make a kind of early pemmican of food that could be carried for days, even weeks. It gave hunters freedom. It gave families a buffer. It meant that survival was no longer chained to immediate kills. You could prepare. You could plan. And in the Ice Age, that was revolutionary. This also had effects on social structure. If one member of a group knew how to process bone well, their knowledge became vital. That person might not be the fastest hunter or the strongest carrier, but they were the one who could extract life from what others had missed. In a world where fat equaled survival, that was no small role. It's possible that this helped distribute status in new ways. Not just brute strength, but skill and patience began to matter, and so the bone cracked, drained, repurposed, became a kind of cornerstone, not only of nutrition, but of culture. It connected tool-making, food storage, knowledge transfer, and even emotional memory. Children likely watched their elders split bones and understood, this is how we live. Not by fire alone, not by the hunt alone, but by returning to what is left behind, by knowing where the real nourishment hides, and by trusting that what is hidden is worth the effort. This was the quiet logic of Ice Age survival, not always heroic, rarely triumphant, but rooted in attention to the land, to the body, to the rhythms of decay and preservation. In a world of scarcity, survival belonged not just to the strongest, but to the most observant. those who could see value in what others overlooked. Those who knew that a femur left in snow was not garbage, but potential. This mindset didn't vanish. We see its legacy in later traditions in grease extraction among Arctic peoples, in marrow recipes passed down through steppe cultures, in the reverent way some hunter-gatherers still speak of animals they consume. It is a respect born not of sentiment, but of proximity to loss. When you know how quickly hunger arrives, you learn to honor what feeds you. And marrow, more than almost any other substance, represented that relationship. Intimate, fragile, hard-won. It also reveals something about early cognition, the ability to plan, to remember, to delay gratification. These are not trivial traits, they're cognitive milestones. Knowing where you buried a marrow-rich bone 2 days ago, returning when others have nothing left, understanding that fat today means warmth tomorrow. These are small decisions that become survival strategies. And over thousands of years, they helped shape not just the body, but the mind. Because there's a deeper truth here, too, one not easily seen in fossil or artifact. The marrow ritual required trust. Trust that the energy spent cracking the bone would be worth it. Trust that someone else would not take what you buried. Trust that your knowledge would hold true, that the place you found nourishment last season would yield again. In a way, these quiet acts of survival were also social contracts. They tethered people together, not in speech, but in shared skill. And when a band gathered after a long hunt, when meat had been stripped and fires burned low, it may have been the marrow, this hidden, patient food, that offered the last warmth of the day. Passed between hands, scooped and shared. Not much, but enough. So we begin here, not with spectacle, but with precision. Not with the heroic image of man versus beast, but with the moment after, when all that's left is bone, and inside the bone, life. The Ice Age was not survived through domination, but through decisions like these. Quiet, repetitive, invisible to time, except for the cracked fragments archaeologists find, scattered in ash pits and shelter floors. But in those cracks is the story of us not just surviving, but thinking, planning, remembering, and it all began with the decision to strike a bone. Not to kill, but to unlock. To take what was hidden. To leave nothing behind. There is a kind of hunger that cannot be outrun, a slow, persistent ache that settles into the bones when meat is scarce and winter lingers too long. In such seasons, salvation came not from the hunt, but from the earth itself. Beneath frost-hardened soil, deep under the roots of bitter grasses and tangled shrubs, lay the starch-laden tubers that offered one of humanity's oldest survival foods. But these were not fruits of abundance. Raw, many were toxic or indigestible. Their gift could only be unlocked by fire, and not just any fire. Open flame would ruin them. To make these roots edible required something older, slower, and more patient, the quiet heat of ash. Across continents, long before the invention of pottery or metal, Ice Age humans learned to bury their food in smoldering pits. Ash ovens, simple depressions lined with hot coals and covered with soil and stones. Into these wombs of warmth went tubers, bulbs, and fibrous stems. Hours passed. Then came the reveal. Soft, fragrant, transformed. What had once poisoned now nourished. It was chemistry conducted in silence, under the sky, by people who could not name the molecules they were mastering, only trust the wisdom encoded in tradition. Archaeologists have found these ancient ovens scattered across sites in Africa, Australia, and the Americas. Some date back tens of thousands of years. At Border Cave in South Africa, the charred remains of hypoxis roots, still retaining their signature star shape, tell us that even Homo sapiens' earliest ancestors relied on these underground crops. And where there are ovens, there are patterns. Regular digging spots, repeat burn layers. The remnants of a food system mapped not by fences or furrows, but by memory and migration. This knowledge was passed through generations, not with instructions, but with practice. Children watched as their elders poked into the earth with digging sticks, testing the soil's give, judging the season's readiness. They learned the difference between safe and dangerous plants, not from textbooks, but from cautionary tales and cautious mouths. One mistake could cost a life, but success meant sustenance for days. In climates where meat was rare and snowfall could bury the land's surface clues, these tubers became the fallback, the reliable base layer of the Ice Age diet, and it was not just about eating. The act of cooking changed the food and the people. Roasting roots broke down complex carbohydrates, making calories more accessible and digestion easier. It freed time. It reduced chewing. It warmed the hands while waiting. In a world where every moment was tethered to risk, the slowness of ash cooking offered a kind of ritual, not religious perhaps, but deeply human. You sat by the fire, smelled the earth, listened for the crack of heat against stone. You knew that below the surface, something was changing. What does it mean that our species learned to wait for food before it was safe to eat? What kind of mind begins to trust time and temperature as tools for survival? The same mind that learned to read the landscape with its hands. For Ice Age humans, roots were not simply found. They were tracked, remembered, and earned. Many grew beneath the same patches year after year, returning with the rains or waiting dormant through dry spells. Digging wasn't random. It was guided by ancestral knowledge where water pooled in spring, where certain shrubs grew above edible bulbs, where fire had passed the season before and cleared the brush for easier access. Across continents, we find these stories written into the soil. In Australia, Aboriginal groups still use fire to clear land for yam collection, a practice with roots that may go back tens of thousands of years. In North America, camas bulbs were harvested en masse by digging women who knew precisely when the flower stalks faded and the sugars were ripe. In Africa, geophytes with names long forgotten in European tongues were staples across dry plateaus. And in the Amazon, contrary to the popular image of a jungle untouched, the soil itself was transformed, enriched with biochar and waste to support edible root crops over generations. These were not agriculturalists in the modern sense, but they were engineers of wild abundance. Root foods were slow foods. They demanded patience. Some took hours to roast, others needed soaking or repeated baking to remove bitter alkaloids. Yet people did it not once, but again and again, season after season, across regions and cultures. Why? Because in the end, they worked. These hidden organs storing starch to survive the cold or the dry became perfect analogues for human survival strategies. Unseen, resilient, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. And they taught something else too, that cooking wasn't just about meat. That survival wasn't only about hunting. This is a bias. Modern minds still carry the belief that early humans were primarily flesh-eaters, chasing mammoths and bison through snow. But what sustained most groups most of the time was far less cinematic. It was roots and embers, mud and ash, a grandmother testing the softness of a roasted tuber by pressing her thumb against its skin, a child learning to blow gently into a pit to reignite coals. There's dignity in this labor. And intimacy too. No spears, no trophies, just earth, fire, and transformation. And while these acts left few bones for archaeologists to marvel at, they left clues all the same. In carbon layers, in burned stones, in the distribution of plant microfossils around hearths. A handful of charred starch grains in a sediment layer can say more about persistence than a cache of weapons, because they tell of meals that nourish the whole group. Quietly, reliably, these were foods without glory, but with memory, cooked slowly, shared completely, and forgotten only because they left no skeletons to remember them by. Yet their impact remains, written into the evolutionary record. Cooking, especially of starches, reshaped human biology. It allowed the gut to shrink, the brain to grow, the hours spent chewing to decline. Even before the first pots or pans existed, the shift from raw to cooked food rewired the human story. And root roasting was one of the first, Simplest forms of this transformation: a rock-lined pit, a few coals, a bulb buried in ash. That was all it took to begin altering the destiny of a species. Unlike boiling or stewing, which required containers and constant attention, roasting in ash was low-tech, low maintenance, and highly portable. You could dig a pit in almost any terrain. You could leave the roots to cook while doing other tasks. And you could use the same fire that warmed your shelter or dried your tools. It was modular survival, scalable, repeatable. And unlike meat, which spoiled quickly and drew predators, tubers could last for days, even weeks if kept cool and dry. They were the quiet food of continuity. In Europe, charred tuber fragments have been found at Paleolithic campsites, alongside animal bones and flint tools. In Africa, sediment analyses from rock shelters have revealed phytoliths, microscopic plant fossils from cooked roots, going back 170,000 years. In Asia and Oceania, similar evidence ties early humans to geophyte use. And while the exact species varied: yams, sedges, cattails, camas, lily roots, the logic was the same. These foods were not glamorous, but they were dependable. And dependable matters, because the Ice Age was not an age of constant catastrophe. It was an age of slow shifts, of long winters and shorter growing seasons, of migrations that stretched across generations. To survive such rhythms required more than luck or brute force. It required calibration, knowing what would grow where, what would come back, what would poison unless treated, and how long to wait before digging. This was a form of knowledge rarely recognized in the heroic images of prehistory. But it was no less demanding. To feed a group not just today, but next week. To predict when the roots would be ready. To prepare ash ovens when fuel was scarce. This was intelligence. Not the kind you write down, but the kind you pass on by doing. Gesture by gesture, season by season, fire by fire. Even today, some indigenous communities retain the knowledge of these foods. Their cooking methods are not relics. They are continuities, echoes of a time when humans lived in direct negotiation with land, season, and flame. To watch a tuber roast in a slow, smoky pit is to watch a 200,000-year-old process unfold almost unchanged, because before we had knives or kettles or recipes, we had this: a root, a fire, and the patience to wait. That patience was not just practical, it was cultural. In the rhythm of roasting roots, something deeper was happening: the early structuring of time. When a meal takes hours to become edible, people learn to anticipate, to delay, to sit together around heat and embers. In that space of waiting, stories are told, skills are shown. Knowledge is transferred not through instruction, but through presence. Children learn to identify root-bearing plants long before they understood the words for their dangers. They watched where the elders dug. They followed the scent of cooked starch rising from ash. They touched the cooling coals with careful fingers and pulled apart the darkened skins of roasted bulbs. These were their first tools of comprehension, not abstract knowledge, but sensory intimacy. A world understood by doing, by tasting, by watching fire do its work. And the method mattered. In an age before pots or pans, everything had to adapt to the elements. Ash ovens didn't need containers. They didn't require trade or technology. They required only earth and fire, two things always near, always accessible. This made root roasting universally achievable, whether in tundra or savanna, forest or floodplain. Wherever there was fuel and underground starch, there was possibility. Even in permafrost zones, humans adapted. Roots could be pre-frozen and still cooked if buried in insulated fire pits. In wetlands, plants like cattails or sedges could be roasted into edible pulp, their fibrous stems softened by prolonged heat. And in places with limited wood, people learned to use dung or dry grass as slow-burning fuel. There was always a way, because there had to be. For the Ice Age human, a missed meal meant more than hunger. It meant weakness. It meant risk. And so, even a single roasted root became part of a larger calculus of energy, endurance, and survival. You didn't roast for taste. You roasted to continue. But taste came anyway. Slight sweetness from caramelized sugars, softness that mimicked cooked meat, smokiness from the ash. These were quiet pleasures, unrecorded but real. And they mattered too. Because in a life filled with repetition and danger, comfort had to be found where it could. A warm root in cold hands, a meal shared before sleep. These were moments of restoration, however brief. There is archaeological silence around such scenes. No bones, no tools, just a layer of burned soil and a scattering of carbonized fragments. But those fragments tell us enough. That here, someone knew where to dig, that they chose to cook, that they chose to stay a while longer. And in staying, they made something that mattered not just food, but continuity. Continuity not only of bodies, but of knowledge, of rhythm, of place. Every ash-roasted root carried with it a memory of fire, a moment of survival, and a signal that someone before had figured out how to turn the earth itself into nourishment. In the slow choreography of digging, burning, burying, and waiting, the human relationship with the land deepened from extraction to dialogue, from chance to craft. This craft, for all its subtlety, was civilization in embryo. Long before agriculture fixed humans to fields, root roasting invited them to return to certain places seasonally, to pass on mental maps, to form routines. It was one of the earliest anchors of tradition, not carved into stone or recorded in ochre, but embedded in soil and remembered through repetition. Some roots required multi-stage preparation, first roasting, then pounding or leaching. Others demanded precise timing. Too early, and they were toxic. Too late, and they were gone. The stakes were real, and the margin for error was thin. That thin line between edibility and danger reveals how much Ice Age survival depended not on brute force, but on nuance. The skill to distinguish a nourishing tuber from a fatal one, the intuition to read the land's subtle cues, the restraint to wait for a food source to mature. These were not lesser skills than hunting. They were simply quieter, less likely to leave a dramatic fossil, but vital all the same. In a sense, these roasting pits were humanity's first kitchens. But unlike modern kitchens filled with tools and recipes, these were places of instinct. Places where meals were made by feel, by smell, by memory. Fire had to be just right, not too hot, or the roots would burn, not too cold, or they would remain hard and bitter. There were no thermometers, only fingers pressed to stones, only eyes gauging the color of embers, and when the cooking was done, there was sharing. Not just of calories, but of warmth, of attention, of time. The fire was not only for cooking, it was for gathering. In this way, food preparation became a form of social binding. Roasting roots became an act not just of survival, but of connection. We may never know the names they gave to these plants. We may never know the exact words whispered around those coals. But we know this. The people who waited by the fire lived long enough to pass something on. A technique, a route, a memory of flavor. And so we find their traces in the ashes beneath shelters, in the blackened bulbs in ancient middens, in the stories that still echo in surviving oral traditions. They lived without farming, without fridges, but not without food, and certainly not without fire. When the mammoths vanished from view, and the elk herds migrated far beyond reach, the people turned not to fire or stone, but to the soft pull of water. In the silence that followed failed hunts, rivers became more than pathways. They became promises, wide, meandering arteries beneath glacier-fed skies, carrying more than just meltwater. They carried memory. They carried fish, but not fish the way we think of them now, not caught with rods or lines, not won with luck or leisure. These were fish taken with patience, with knowledge, with contraptions designed to work when hands could not. Along the edges of swollen streams and braided deltas, humans laid their quiet traps, not to chase, but to wait. Basket weirs woven from reeds and willow branches. Stone dams curved across narrow points, channels shaped not by accident but by design. These were not primitive inventions. They were hydrological insights encoded in sticks and stone. How many days did it take to understand the current? How many lost meals before someone saw the rhythm in the flow? There was no room for mistakes. Not when each caught fish could mean an extra night of warmth, another breath spared. The art of Paleolithic fishing was born not in abundance, but in desperation. Not in ease, but in adaptation. The further north one went, the more vital these quiet harvests became. Salmon, char, grayling creatures with their own seasonal clocks moving upriver like clockwork toward cold spawning grounds. And with them, humans moved too, setting up camps not randomly, but according to the fish calendar. Life, arranged by gills and scales. What tools remain are subtle. Fish bones in cave layers, charred scales in hearths. Tiny barbs carved from bone, too fragile to serve as weapons, but just right for snaring fins. Yet the absence of metal, the lack of preserved nets, has often blinded us to the sophistication of these techniques. These people were engineers of flow, designers of patience. They read the rise of riverbanks, the swirl of eddies, the migration of prey, not from books, but from years of kneeling beside water, watching, listening, learning how water forgets nothing, and gives only when asked the right way. And when the fish came, they came in pulses, not one at a time, but in hundreds. A sudden windfall that demanded new problems to solve. How to keep what cannot last. How to save a glut of life in a world that punishes waste. This was not a modern concern. It was an Ice Age dilemma. And from this dilemma, a second invention emerged: the fire, not for warmth, but for preservation. Drying, smoking, hanging fish along racks until the flesh tightened and the fat retreated into itself. Until a perishable thing became portable. The fish, no longer slippery and quick, became time-made edible. A future, folded and stored. What does it mean when survival depends not on the kill, but on the wait? It means a different kind of intelligence was required. One not of pursuit, but of presence. One that tuned itself to the subtleties of flow and season, to the patience of watching water darken with shadow before movement broke the surface. Fish did not roar or stampede. They shimmered. They flicked. And to catch them, one had to mirror their silence. In that quiet, Paleolithic people became masters of preservation. A fresh catch was a brief fortune, but a dried one was strategy. Flesh was sliced thin, then stretched on racks of branch or bone. Smoke was used not just to flavor, but to guard against rot, flies, and time. In wind-sheltered alcoves or sunlit rock shelves, fish became more than food. They became storage, insurance, a promise that when the rivers froze, there would still be something left to chew. Some techniques used only smoke. Others, a combination of sun and air. Some cultures used slow, low fires that smoldered for days, infusing meat with preservative oils. Others relied on cold, dry winds, letting the environment itself become the preserver. There were no freezers, but there were clever hands, attentive eyes, generations of testing, failure, and adaptation. In northern regions, caches of dried fish were sometimes hidden in stone hollows or elevated on poles to avoid scavengers. Arctic and subarctic peoples carried similar techniques into the historical period, suggesting deep ancestral roots. This was not improvisation, it was inheritance. And the smoking fire became a kind of hearth in itself, a center not for comfort but for planning, for making hunger manageable. Even the waste had purpose. Scales could be burned for fuel, bones used in tools or rituals, oil-rich scraps fed dogs, or were rendered into fat. There was a completeness to the process. Nothing left to spoil, nothing taken for granted. This attitude toward fish reflected a broader Ice Age logic. Everything had to earn its place. Every calorie preserved was a future step secured. But perhaps most telling is how central fish became in regions where game animals had grown scarce. In places like the upper Paleolithic sites along the Meuse and Danube, layers of fishbone rival those of large mammals. In the Japanese archipelago, evidence from Jomon sites suggests complex fishing cultures well before agriculture arrived. Even in areas less known for aquatic abundance, seasonal fish runs were anticipated and exploited, with humans arriving not randomly, but deliberately, following migrations like ghosts of the water. These were not accidents. These were economies. And in these economies, fish were more than meat. They were rhythm. They were anchor. They tied families to river mouths and valley floors, to inlets and oxbows, to cold spring-fed streams and summer shallows. They shaped migration routes. They built memory into the landscape. Where the land gave little, the rivers remembered, and so did the people. Not with writing, not with maps, but with return, with the yearly migration of bodies alongside the fish they followed. Generation after generation, children were brought back to the same bends in the river, the same gravel bars where the water grew still and shallow. They learned where to step, when to wait, how to read the surface tension for the flicker of scales. To fish was not merely to feed, it was to remember, to belong. In this way, fish did not just fill stomachs. They stitched together time. They offered continuity in a world that was otherwise restless, dangerous, and shifting. This is perhaps why fish remains begin to show up more heavily during climatic downturns, during colder, leaner periods, when large game grew scarce and uncertain. People turned to the rivers not because they preferred it, but because they had learned to trust its cycles, and the trust was repaid in flesh. Not red like mammoth or deer, but pale, firm, oily. Fish offered a different kind of sustenance, high in protein, rich in omega fats, dense with nutrients often missing from cold climate diets. In coastal areas, shellfish and marine species added iodine, calcium, and vitamin D. Inland, freshwater fish became crucial for survival when winter sun no longer supplied enough. Bones tell the tale. Many Ice Age skeletons from riverine settlements show signs of diets reliant on fish, not occasionally, but predominantly. This was not backup food, it was foundation, and it had consequences. Some anthropologists have suggested that such diets may have impacted brain development, endurance, even fertility rates, especially in regions where plant foods were scarce. A single netful of fish could feed dozens for days. Dried, smoked, or fermented, it could be packed for journeys, shared between groups, or stored against famine. Fish were mobile calories, one of the few foods that moved with people rather than against them. The importance of fish is also visible in ancient ritual. In some graves, fish bones were placed alongside the dead not as trash, but as offering. In Magdalenian culture, fish-shaped carvings appear in ivory and bone. In Siberia, shallow fish traps made of stone have been dated to nearly 15,000 years ago, their curves still etched into frozen tundra. These are not the marks of amateurs. They are the fingerprints of people who understood water as intimately as they understood the hunt. And this understanding was deeply gendered and communal. While large game hunting skewed toward male groups, fishing often involved entire camps. Children learned by helping. Elders contributed with strategy. Women were central to processing and preservation. In these moments, food and community were one, because in the Ice Age, survival was never a solo act. It was a shared river, a circle around the fire, a net pulled in, together. That image, a woven tool heavy with life, hauled from cold water by many hands, is perhaps one of the oldest illustrations of human cooperation. Fish blurred the lines between roles. Unlike the solitary tension of the bow or the sudden finality of the spear, the net and the trap required planning, patience, and people. They demanded an understanding not just of the prey, but of each other, and so fishing became a kind of social glue, not in the loud, performative way of feasting or the hierarchy of the hunt, but in quiet, shared tasks, repairing a basket weir together, tending a smoke rack through the night, teaching a child how to feel with bare hands under stones for darting fish. These were intimate acts. They built knowledge across generations, not in lectures or commands, but in repetition, in gesture, in rhythm. We see echoes of this even today, in the few remaining traditional fishing societies groups who pass down their techniques not through words, but through demonstration, who sing to the tides, or name the eddies, or mark their seasons by when the fish turn silver. It is a form of literacy older than writing a literacy of water, and in the Ice Age, this knowledge had to be incredibly precise. Different species required different strategies. Eel traps worked where salmon weirs would fail. In arid regions, fish might be smoked over thornbush fires that left no trace. In colder zones, ice fishing techniques may have existed using bone hooks or sharpened points to probe holes in frozen surfaces. We cannot know every method, but we know from bone assemblages that no two rivers were fished the same way. This was not a one-size-fits-all survival method. It was tailored, tuned, and tested in place. Sometimes, the tools themselves are all that remain. In peat bogs and clay beds, archaeologists have uncovered fragments of fish baskets coiled and woven, reinforced with bark strips. Some show evidence of repair, patchwork mending with sinew or plant fiber. These weren't disposable tools, they were investments, and perhaps even possessions passed from one generation to the next. And like so much in the Ice Age, timing was everything. Fish were not always there. You had to know when to wait, when to travel, when to return. Miss the spawning run by a week, and a group might go hungry for months. But time and the keeping of it is something humans mastered early. We built our calendars not from stars alone, but from rivers, from the return of the fish. This makes fishing not just a means of nourishment, but a deep-time relationship with landscape, a conversation with moving water, one that required memory, discipline, and humility. To wait beside a river is to admit dependence, to cast without hook or line, trusting the trap to fill, and when it did, it was not luck. It was knowledge embodied, not just in the hands that built the traps or the feet that found the shallow bends, but in the bodies themselves, shaped by what was eaten, by what was absorbed from water and flesh and bone. Fish left their mark on Ice Age humans not just as meals, but as chemistry. Bones thickened by minerals, joints softened by fats, brains nourished by long-chain oils that could not be found in meat alone. In a world of hunger, fish were brain food, and that mattered, not because intelligence was a luxury, but because reading the land, predicting the seasons, and coordinating action all demanded cognition. In some sense, survival was a mental game. Those who could think together, plan, remember, adapt, stayed alive. And fish, quiet and slippery though they were, helped power that capacity. But their contribution wasn't just biological, it was also cultural. Alongside preserved meat and foraged roots, fish provided a rare blend of portability and abundance. That made them perfect for gatherings. When rivers swelled with the melt of spring, groups that had spent winter isolated sometimes returned to the same water sources, not by coincidence, but by design. These were times of reunion, trade, marriage, memory, and at the heart of it, fish, charred bones scattered around hearths, scales ground into soil, traces of meals shared and forgotten. These are the subtle signatures archaeologists now piece together, hints of ancient diets and of the people who depended on them. It's not a story of drama, of chase and kill, but of resilience, of making do with what shimmered in the shallows when the great herds failed to appear. There's humility in this kind of subsistence. Fish are small, slippery, hard to catch, and easy to underestimate. Yet over tens of thousands of years, it was they, not mammoths, not cave lions, that fed the most people, that carried bands across famine years, that filled stomachs when the world seemed to offer little. And maybe this is why the memory of fishing endures so long, so widely. In every culture, in every era, we find images of it scratched into bone, painted on walls, whispered in myth. It is one of the oldest acts of hope, to reach into water and believe that something will answer. Even now, in modern rivers, when someone casts a line or lays a trap, They echo this Ice Age rhythm, the wait, the quiet, the pull, because long before farming, long before cities, it was the rivers that fed us. It was the fish that taught us to be still, to be patient, to work together, and to trust, even when hungry, that life could move unseen beneath the surface until we learned how to read it. But not all food waited quietly in the water. Some shimmered in places far harder to reach, tucked into cliff faces, lodged high in trees, protected by a furious hum of wings. Honey, unlike fish or meat, did not surrender. It had to be taken, and the price of taking it was pain. Still, people climbed. We know this not just from stories, but from soot-scored cave walls, where figures are drawn mid-ascent, smoke rising from bundles below, hands reaching toward hives nested in impossible heights. One such image, etched more than 8,000 years ago in eastern Spain, shows a human suspended from vines, bees swirling around their head. But the practice itself is older, much older, likely stretching back tens of thousands of years long before the first pottery, long before herds were tamed or seeds were sown, because honey was different. It was the one food that was not hunted or grown or gathered in the ordinary way. It was raided. It required intrusion, calculation, sacrifice. In cold seasons when fat was scarce and meat dried thin on the bone, honey offered something else fast, sweet energy, pure sugar, a jolt of life that needed no chewing, no boiling, no fire, and because it came with danger, it came with memory. You did not forget the time you were stung. You did not forget the cliff that broke beneath your foot. You remembered the burn of smoke in your eyes, the hum against your skin, the taste that followed. That memory was survival. Because not every hive gave its gold. Some were decoys, long abandoned. Others were too deep, too high, too well defended. And yet, again and again, people returned. They watched the flight paths of bees. They marked the trees. They timed their raids for cooler hours, when bees were sluggish and smoke held its edge. This was not brute force. It was patience turned to skill. And it shows up not just in images, but in patterns of behavior. In Hadza groups of East Africa, who still raid hives today, men follow bird calls, the honey guide species that evolved alongside humans, pointing the way in exchange for wax. It is a partnership as old as speech, perhaps older, and it suggests that even the wildest foods were part of a system, one where animals, fire, and knowledge all converged. Honey, in this sense, was more than food. It was a reward for knowing, a prize for reading the land, reading the bees, and knowing what to risk. And in that way, it mirrored everything else Ice Age people depended on, not certainty, but attention, not ease, but effort. Honey was not daily, but it was remembered, because each encounter left more than sweetness on the tongue. It left marks on the skin, in the mind, and in the map of the seasons. To remember honey was to remember risk, and that memory lived not just in the individual, but in the group. Stories of stings became caution. Tales of falls became teaching, and through these stories, the act of honey hunting evolved into something more. A tradition of knowledge passed by pain. Some of the oldest foraging groups alive today still practice this ancient ritual. The Hadza of Tanzania use firebrands and keen observation to follow bees across dry scrubland. The Gurung of Nepal descend sheer cliffs using rope ladders, braving clouds of angry bees to gather wild honey from rock crevices. These aren't echoes of a lost world. They are its continuation. Their methods may differ, but the logic remains the same. The reward must be greater than the risk, or the climb is not worth it. And the reward was rich. Honey, gram for gram, offered a dense source of energy: glucose, fructose, trace nutrients. In cold seasons, when fat stores thinned and muscle burned too quickly, even small amounts of sugar could carry the body through moments of weakness. And unlike meat or roots, honey could occasionally be stored in natural containers, sealed inside comb, wrapped in leaves, buried cool in shade. It spoiled slower than most foods, and when fermented, it gained new life. Fermented honey mead may have been among humanity's earliest experiments with alcohol. The transformation of sugar into something intoxicating was not just chemical, it was cultural. A shared drink, lightly fermented, could accompany song, grief, celebration. If honey raids were physical trials, the mead that followed them was spiritual harvest, a way to stretch the labor into something communal, symbolic, perhaps even sacred. And yet, honey never became a staple. It didn't grow predictably. It couldn't be planted, harvested, or managed, at least not in the Ice Age. It existed on the edge of the known, a gift, not a guarantee. This preserved its mystique. In a world ruled by cold logic and biological necessity, honey stood apart an indulgence, but also a reminder that not everything humans pursued was strictly utilitarian. Some risks were taken for beauty, for sensation, for sweetness alone. Even in burial sites, beeswax residue has been found on tools or containers, suggesting not just use, but intention. It may have sealed pots, softened hides, scented the air. These fragments tell us that honey was more than food. It was an atmosphere, a trace of warmth in a cold world, a scent that clung to memory long after the fire dimmed. It was rare, it was dangerous, it was sweet, and so it became a signal not just of nourishment, but of timing. The ability to track honey meant more than a treat. It showed awareness. It meant you were tuned to the invisible shifts in your environment, that you noticed which flowers bloomed earliest, that you remembered where last year's hives had clung to the cliff or nestled high in the birch, that you returned at the right moment, not too soon and not too late. In this way, honey hunters were also quiet ecologists, listening to the land's unspoken cues. This attunement mattered more than tools. You could not force a hive to yield. Fire had to be used with care. Smoke calmed the bees, dulled their defenses. Too much, and the comb would melt, the honey scorched or lost. Too little, and the swarm would drive you back, stinging your face, eyes, hands. The trick was not violence, it was rhythm. Approach slow, apply, smoke gently, cut only what you could carry, leave enough for the colony to survive. In this, honey hunting was an early form of restraint, of sustainability, of knowing how much was enough. That balance gave honey symbolic weight. In rock paintings, honeycombs and bees appear not just as objects, but as metaphors. Some are drawn near sunbursts or stars, linking sweetness with light. Others show figures ascending not in violence, but in yearning, climbing for something just out of reach. These images may echo a broader theme, that honey stood for reward through effort. That sweetness could only be earned through risk, knowledge, and pain. And so, among Ice Age people, honey became part of a seasonal calendar, a marker of late spring or summer. Its arrival signaled a brief surplus, a moment to recover, to share. For groups often caught in the cycle of scarcity, this mattered deeply. A full comb could lift morale. It could be given to elders too weak to chew meat, or to children sick with fever. It offered not just sugar, but morale. A reminder that not all survival was grey and cold. Sometimes, the value of honey was deferred. A hive discovered late in the season might be marked, then left alone to grow, to thicken, to mature. A return weeks later meant more wax, more honey, perhaps even larvae. These larvae, while perhaps repulsive to modern palates, were rich in fat and protein. Eaten raw, roasted, or stirred into mash, they offered dense nutrition. Again, the bee gave more than one gift, and humans, in their hunger, learned how to take each one. Yet the act of climbing remained central. It was not just functional. It was emblematic of effort, of skill, of vertical memory. Few things in the Ice Age demanded such exposure. Few required you to leave the ground, the group, the fire. But for honey they did, because in the high places, life offered something golden, not guaranteed, not safe, but golden in color, in energy, in meaning. And this glow, this rare sweetness, lingered in memory. That matters. Because in the Ice Age, memory was more than recollection. It was survival. It told you where danger had been, where food had once bloomed, where a hive had thrived before the winter frost returned. To forget was to starve, but to remember and to teach was to pass on a living map. These maps weren't drawn, they were sung, spoken, acted out in the stories around fires. A boy might hear how his uncle fell from a tree reaching too far, and remember not to overreach. A girl might learn how the bees gather near certain flowering shrubs, and how the smoke must rise slowly. This wasn't just knowledge. It was legacy carved not into stone, but into habit, repeated until it became instinct. That instinct extended into rituals. Honey was often collected with ceremony, the lighting of the torch, the painting of the body, the calling to the bees. In some cultures, chants were sung to calm the hive, or to thank the spirits of the tree. We cannot know what exact words were spoken in the Ice Age, but in the rhythms of modern foragers, we glimpse echoes of reverence, of relationship, and that relationship was not one of dominance. Humans did not domesticate bees during the Ice Age. They did not keep them, move them, or breed them. The hives were always wild. The bees chose their homes, and humans came as guests, skilled, determined, but guests nonetheless. To take too much was to invite stings, collapse, loss. The hive was a teacher as much as a prize. Sometimes the price was high. Cliffside honey raids claimed lives. Swarms disfigured faces. Eyes were lost, fingers broken. But the memory of that pain, too, was folded into the culture. A warning, a myth, perhaps even a rite of passage. To endure the bees and return with the comb marked a threshold not just of courage, but of belonging, because the honey was not only for the self, it was for the group. And in that act of return, sticky, swollen, triumphant, a kind of quiet heroism emerged. Not the kind sung in battle or displayed in conquest, but the kind that fed others, that sweetened hunger, that said, I suffered, so we could rest. In a world where much was taken by force, this was something offered, and so honey, in its fragility and fire, taught something lasting. That not all food was found below, that some gifts hung just beyond reach, and that to gather them, humans had to climb, not just trees, but toward patience, toward balance, toward a deeper kind of nourishment, the kind that asked for pain and gave back more than it took. Even after the hunger passed, the memory lingered, not just of taste, but of the journey. Honey was rarely just eaten and forgotten. It became part of the internal landscape, recalled in dreams, in stories told to the young, in the way someone's hands reached for a burning branch with a practiced rhythm. In this way, the pursuit of sweetness left marks on behavior, on language, on culture. It was a rare food, yes, but also a teacher. Some Ice Age sites preserve fragments of this learning. In rock shelters across southern Europe and northern Africa, red ochre and beeswax have been found together, an improbable pairing that hints at ceremony. Beeswax softened pigment, made it easier to shape into marks, and in those marks, perhaps the human hand was trying to preserve not only symbols but sensation, a memory of sunlight, of sugar, of risk endured, and reward received. In tropical and temperate zones, where wild bees thrived, seasonal patterns became intertwined with foraging routes. Groups timed their migrations not only to follow herds or find ripening roots, but to reach cliffs or trees when honey might be ready. These places became part of the mental geography known, returned to, spoken of with the quiet reverence usually reserved for water sources or shelter. In the Ice Age, a good hive could be as valuable as a spring, perhaps even more. And unlike other sources of food, honey held up over time. Dried meat spoiled, nuts could rot, even marrow turned rancid. But honey, if sealed, if cool, endured. This gave it value far beyond calories. It could be kept for the sick, the young, the old. It could travel, it could be hidden. A resource not just for now, but for later. In a world ruled by immediate need, that alone made it powerful. Power invites meaning. And so honey became more than sustenance. It became symbol. It may have been offered at burials, left in sacred places, daubed on objects of importance. It crossed the line between edible and ritual, between survival and soul. And through this crossing, humans revealed something about themselves, that they did not only want to live, they wanted to feel, to remember, to reach for what lay just beyond what was needed. In the end, the Ice Age did not end with honey. Farming brought other sugars, more reliable sources, more control. But something was lost in that trade. Something untamed, something vertical, something that had to be climbed for, bled for, endured. And though modern life surrounds us with sweetness, little of it carries the same meaning, little of it was earned. But once, long ago, sweetness came with smoke, with stings, with courage, and through that, it taught something larger, that not all things worth tasting are safe, and not all things gathered were grown. Some were chased, some were climbed to, and some, like honey, were only found by those who knew the way up. But others required a different kind of knowing, not of ascent, but of descent. A knowing of the soil, of the bark, of the hush beneath stones and logs. To survive the Ice Age was not only to hunt or to climb, but to crawl, to kneel in leaf litter and scrape at silence, chasing protein that did not bleed or flee, but wriggled, pulsed, and clung to damp places. Beneath the human revulsion we carry now lies an older memory, one in which insects were not strange, but staple: grubs, termites, caterpillars, ants. Insect protein was never decorative. It was dense, efficient, high in fat when fat was rare, packed with nutrients when larger prey had fled or failed. In modern hunter-gatherers like the Hadza or the San, we still see traces of this practice: women digging into termite mounds with fire-hardened sticks, children collecting mopane worms by hand. The prehistoric record is less obvious, yet it whispers the same truth. At sites in Africa, Asia, and Australia, residues of insect shells gather in layers, overlooked but persistent. This was not famine food. It was familiarity. But in order to access it, people had to become something quieter. Foraging for insects, especially at night, demanded a deep attentiveness. No grand movements, no noisy tools. Just the hush of a stick, the careful turning of a log, the pause before plunging a hand into uncertain earth. And all of this often in places where the forager was not the only hunter. The night was full of breath, of paws and wings and fangs. But in that darkness, humans moved anyway, not with dominance, but with precision. They knew where larvae clustered, when beetles hatched, how woodpeckers hinted at hidden nests. They did not flinch. This kind of food gathering leaves fewer bones, fewer tools. It is harder to memorialize in stone, but it shaped Ice Age life in quiet ways. The protein it provided meant another day of strength, another child fed, another old man made useful again. It allowed smaller groups to persist through bad seasons. It made movement possible when large kills were too dangerous or too far. Insect food was, in a very real sense, survival food. And in certain regions, it was not marginal, it was central. So why, when we tell stories of the past, do we forget this? Why does the idea of our ancestors eating insects feel like a fall from grace, rather than a mark of brilliance? Perhaps because we have confused luxury with wisdom. But to know how to eat the forest, not just the flesh, but the pulse beneath the bark, is not shameful. It is human. To look past revulsion and into the logic of the land. To understand that the forest feeds in many forms, and that sometimes survival means redefining what is precious. Insects were not emergency rations. They were dependable, cyclical, and deeply known. But they came with a price, not in danger alone, but in the knowledge required to gather them well. Unlike berries that could be seen from a distance, or animals that left tracks, insects asked for intimacy. One had to know where a particular beetle laid its eggs, how long a rotten stump would harbor larvae before the pupation ended, or when the first rains would call termites from the earth in edible clouds. These were not obvious facts. They were learned slowly, shared, carefully passed from mouth to ear like a quiet chant. In places like prehistoric China, excavations have revealed grinding stones with traces of insect chitin, suggesting mass preparation. In parts of Europe, burned layers at cave sites hold the crushed remnants of beetles, not swept aside, but collected. In Africa and Southeast Asia, even today, seasonal festivals are built around these once overlooked foods. The flying ant swarms, the cricket harvests, the glow of larvae under stripped bark. These aren't accidents of poverty. They are traditions of insight. But to forage at night in a world where saber-toothed cats, hyenas, and even giant snakes hunted in the same shadows required more than technique. It demanded quiet bravery. The kind of courage that doesn't announce itself, but crouches low, barefoot, feeling the shift in temperature where insects burrow. A certain patch of earth feels warmer. A log sounds hollow. A scent lifts from the ground like memory. And so they dig, these Ice Age foragers, with fire-warmed sticks or bare hands, pulling life from places most would overlook. And all of this, the knowledge, the danger, the timing, could not be done alone. Night foraging was often quiet, but not solitary. Small groups worked together, one watching, one gathering. Mothers taught daughters, older siblings taught younger ones. And sometimes, when the silence was too thick, a song was hummed not for beauty, but rhythm, to keep time. To warn of bears. There is a reverence in this kind of eating, not of ceremony, but of closeness, because when you eat the insects of your forest, you are not separate from it. You are participating in its smallest circulations, its hatchings, its decompositions, its hum beneath bark. Insects fed the birds, who fed the foxes, who fed the people. To eat from the base of the web was not to be desperate. It was to be attuned, and in that attunement lay an advantage that many would overlook, but few could do without. Because for Ice Age humans, especially in lean seasons or unpredictable climates, insects offered something few other foods could: consistency. While large game might migrate, vanish, or fight back, insects were embedded in the land itself. They came with the warmth of spring, with the rot of fallen trees, with the bloom of certain plants. If you paid attention, they came like clockwork, and they brought more than calories. Many species of larvae are rich in fat, a fact often lost in modern nutrition discourse. Some provide calcium, iron, and even trace amounts of vital micronutrients. This mattered in times when diets leaned heavily toward protein with little balance. Where fat was scarce, larvae were gold. Where salt was absent, insect shells and fluids provided minerals scraped from soil and wood. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't visible in grave goods or cave art, but it was vital. This makes the silence in our archaeological record more curious. Perhaps it's because insect remains are fragile, easily destroyed, quickly consumed, rarely fossilized. Or perhaps it's because the modern mind resists the notion so completely that we've failed to ask the right questions. But in recent years, ethnographers and archaeologists have begun to reframe the narrative. They look not just for bones, but for traces, soil chemistry, residue on tools, patterns in hearths that suggest smaller bites. What they're finding is not occasional use, but recurring behavior. And still, our revulsion lingers. Insects are so closely tied to decay in our minds that we rarely imagine them as nourishment. But in doing so, we ignore what Ice Age humans understood, without judgment. That hunger is not aesthetic. It is pragmatic. The revulsion we feel is not innate. It is taught, and it can be untaught. Some indigenous groups, even today, still carry this understanding. In the Amazon, the fat, slow-moving larvae of the palm weevil are considered a delicacy. In Australia, the witchetty grub remains an ancestral food, prized for its buttery texture and sustaining power. These traditions may seem foreign, but they are echoes, echoes of a time when our species was not so removed from what the earth offered directly. And importantly, eating insects was not always about scarcity. Sometimes it was preference. A smoked grub could be sweeter than meat. A roasted cricket could be easier to digest than raw greens. During the Ice Age, when fires were precious and bellies uncertain, people learned what worked, and insects, as it turned out, worked well. Even in death, they returned the favor. Insects recycled the forest, cleared carcasses, fed birds. They reminded humans of decay and renewal of the cycle they too belonged to. To eat them was not to break that cycle, but to acknowledge it. A lesson that only comes when you kneel close to the earth and listen. Because for all their smallness, insects taught Ice Age humans a large truth, that survival did not always come in grand gestures or heroic hunts, but in quiet attentions. Insects required no chase, no spear, no fire, only knowledge, timing, and care. And foraging for them became not only a way to feed the body, but to train the senses. It sharpened perception. It rewarded patience. It gave structure to the day and even to the dark. Among the Hadza of East Africa, a group whose foraging lifeways echo Paleolithic rhythms, honey, grubs, and termite eggs remain part of the seasonal diet. Their methods poking into hives, tapping logs, watching bird behavior are not instinctual, but inherited, passed from elder to child, shaped by experience, and tuned to the fluctuations of an unforgiving landscape. It is not hard to imagine a similar exchange 20,000 years ago, as fathers showed sons how to peel away bark, or mothers taught daughters to distinguish between the buzz of danger and the silence of reward. And yet, this knowledge was not static. It traveled. When people migrated, they carried with them a catalogue of cues. What insect calls signaled hatching, what soil color revealed burrows, what season brought what wing. They adapted their understanding to new ecosystems, new prey, new rhythms. Across the globe, from the highlands of Papua to the woodlands of Europe, insect foraging strategies evolved with the land itself. Some foraged at dusk, when the predators slept and the grubs surfaced. Others waited until dawn, using the rising sun to flush out termites from their mounds. Some used smoke to drive insects from logs. Others used water, flooding small patches of soil to coax worms upward. These were not random tricks. They were honed tactics, experimental, repeated, shared, and not just among humans. Ice Age people watched the animals too. Bears peeled trees for beetles. Birds followed ant trails. Some primates even used sticks to fish for termites. Observing this behavior didn't make humans less capable. It made them more so. Mimicry is a tool of intelligence, and in the prehistoric world, no creature had a monopoly on insight. But perhaps the greatest lesson in insect eating was one of scale. A single grub meant little. A dozen could be a snack. But 100, gathered over time, dried in the sun or roasted on embers, could bridge the hunger between kills. They were the difference between waiting and wasting, between fasting and enduring. To eat insects was to understand that survival was not about domination, but adaptation. It was not always about finding the biggest prey, but noticing the smallest abundance. Ice Age humans didn't just take what the world gave. They looked deeper, dug lower, stayed quieter, and in doing so, they discovered meals where others saw only mud, rot, and wings. The Ice Age was not a time of abundance. It was a time of cleverness, of grasping at whatever thread could be turned into sustenance. And for many groups, insects became that thread not just in emergency, but in routine. Not as fallback, but as plan. Insects were not the food of the desperate. They were the food of the watchful, the precise, the quietly persistent. But to understand that fully, we must imagine the act itself. Picture a man crouched beside a hollow log in the early light, the air cold and still, his fingers feeling along the bark for softness, for signs. There is no spectacle, no violence, no feast. Only a few careful movements, a flake of wood peeled back, the slow reveal of wriggling white forms. He is hungry, but not rushing. This is not a moment of shame. It is a moment of calm expertise. He selects the fattest ones, places them in a pouch. Perhaps some are eaten immediately, still warm from the log. Others will be roasted later, crisped on stone or fire-wilted leaves. The day continues. In archaeological terms, little of this remains. There are no bones to speak of, no shells to stack in middens. What is left are the tools, the pointed sticks, the shallow scrapers, the fire, blackened hollows in ancient hearths. These hint at a quieter culinary tradition, one that has survived only in echoes, in the lifeways of indigenous peoples who still know where to find nourishment in the ground's smallest corners. For modern audiences, these practices can be difficult to reconcile with the image of prehistoric man as a spear-wielding mammoth hunter. But that image is incomplete. The mammoth was rare. The grub was dependable. One fed the story, the other fed the stomach. And that stomach had rules. It could not survive on lean meat alone. It needed fat. It needed diversity. It needed what insects offered: soft tissue and hard shell, protein and oil, the minerals of the soil transmuted into crawling form. And perhaps, in some quiet way, it also needed the ritual, the going out, the kneeling down, the patience, because this too was part of Ice Age food knowledge, that not all value was visible, and not all food was large. That survival did not always reward the boldest gesture, but often the smallest insight. Insects offered that insight. They blurred the line between decay and nourishment, between revulsion and reward. They invited humans to look again, to think differently, to stay open. And when we do that now, when we imagine them not as pests but as partners in the deep story of human survival, we come a little closer to those who walked before us, to those who did not waste what moved underfoot, to those who knew that even in the darkest bark, something might be waiting to keep you alive. The cold was not only a threat, it was a tool. In a world without salt, without clay pots, without the long-term heat of ovens, preservation required something else. And the Ice Age delivered it in abundance. Snow, ice, frozen caves, shade that lingered long after the sun had moved on. Humans learned to read the land not just for what it gave in the moment, but for what it could guard across time. Imagine the kill, a reindeer, fallen at last. The air is sharp, the ground hard. Blood sinks into frostbitten soil. But the feast cannot be finished in a day. The group is small, the meat vast. And so begins a second labor, not of hunting, but of hiding. Cuts are wrapped in hide or bundled in grasses, then lowered into pits dug by hand and stone. Others are wedged into high crevices, where wind and shadow keep flies away. In places where the snow never fully melts, meat is cached, like memory frozen into the landscape, waiting for leaner weeks. This was not mere instinct. It was knowledge passed hand to hand, elder to child, where to bury, how deep, how to mark the spot so you could find it again, even under snowfall. Stones might be stacked. A line of broken twigs might point the way. And beneath it all, the earth kept its quiet promise. Cold enough, long enough, without containers, preservation depended entirely on context. A crevice could replace a pot. A shaded overhang could serve as a shelf. The still air of a cave mouth became a natural fridge, with meat hung high to deter scavengers and rot. In colder months, the entire world became a storehouse if you moved quickly, buried wisely, and remembered where you left your hope. And not everything stored was clean. Sometimes, a kill site was left behind and returned to days later. Wolves might have taken some. Snow might have hidden the rest. But humans were not always the first to eat. They learned to take what remained: sinew, marrow, partially frozen muscle. They knew the signs of spoilage, the limits of safety, and the desperate math of risk. Because in a world of cold abundance, paradox reigned. Meat was everywhere, but never enough. Even the bones were kept. Heavy with fat, rich with sustenance, they were cached in icy soil or tucked into cave corners, sometimes broken before burial, sometimes saved whole. Weeks later, they might return, strike them with stone, and boil what little they could, or roast it over fire if they had one. And all of this was part of the rhythm: hunt, eat, preserve, return. They did not own the land, but they stored themselves within it. To survive meant knowing not just how to hunt, it meant knowing how to wait. In some regions, waiting could stretch into seasons. What had been buried in the first frost of autumn might not be uncovered until the ground began to thaw months later. This wasn't convenience. It was foresight wrapped in urgency. A family might remember a winter cache as the only thing that had stood between them and starvation the year before, so they returned, not always to feast, but to scrape, to salvage, to find what the snow had kept in trust. This act of returning, of cold caching, shaped more than meals. It shaped movement. People didn't always wander at random. They followed routes of memory, lines between kill sites and storage spots, rivers and ridgelines where food had once been found. The landscape was mapped not in borders, but in meals past and future. Caches became waypoints, and waypoints became stories. Places were named for the hunger they ended, or the kill that fed 10, or the meat that was still there, untouched, beneath the shale. And sometimes, humans didn't kill at all. They watched, they waited. They learned to recognize when wolves abandoned a kill, or when a cave lion had eaten its fill and moved on. Scavenging wasn't shameful, it was efficient. If the meat was cold enough, untouched enough, it could still serve. Humans became experts at reading claw marks, bite patterns, and tracks in snow. They understood what animal had eaten, when, and how much remained. From there, a choice: take it or leave it, risk sickness or risk hunger. These decisions weren't made lightly. In cold environments, illness from spoiled meat could mean death. But wasting calories to hunt again could also mean death. So they weighed each possibility with quiet precision. And in doing so, they developed one of the oldest survival skills we still carry: the ability to plan. Early humans learned to think days ahead, weeks ahead. They cached what could be spared. They returned for what they buried. And in this dance of leaving and returning, they cultivated more than storage techniques. They cultivated trust in the environment, in the cold, in their own ability to remember. Because the cold was not just a freezer, it was a calendar. It told you when food would last, when it wouldn't. When the air grew too warm, the rules changed. Maggots could form. Moisture could creep in. So they adapted again, moving caches higher, choosing different cave mouths, wrapping meat in bark or grass to slow decay. There was no single method, only principles. Shade is better than Sunday. Wind is better than stillness. Deep is better than shallow. And memory is better than chance. And so, Ice Age survival became a choreography of presence and absence, knowing when to leave the meat behind and knowing when to return, not just with hope, but with intent. There is evidence in the soil, in the ring of disturbed earth packed again by human hands, in the scattering of bones beside a kill site, not fresh, not ancient, but returned to. At sites like Schöningen in Germany or Pinsevent in France, archaeologists have uncovered stratified layers that suggest revisitation. The same hearths relit after weeks or months, the same storage pits opened again. Cold caching wasn't a guess. It was a system. It was also a strategy rooted in scarcity. In environments where large prey was rare or seasons brutal, every usable calorie had to be stretched. You couldn't afford to waste what couldn't be eaten that day. The cold became an ally. Snow and ice did what the human body could not. It kept still, and it remembered. The body moved. The cold remained. And in the space between the two, survival was staged. Storage pits were dug in permafrost zones, where decomposition slowed to nearly nothing. Even shallow graves could protect food if dug into the shaded side of a slope. In coastal regions, sea ice became another tool. Caches were buried in drift-covered coves, meat packed under pebbles or icy sand. In some cases, it was not even burial, but suspension. Meat hung in trees to freeze in the open air, safe from scavengers who couldn't climb. All of it required judgment. You had to know your predators, you had to know your weather, and you had to know your group. Storage only worked if others respected it. A cached leg of reindeer was no good if another band came and took it. So humans developed the earliest customs of ownership not as laws but as patterns. Caches might be marked by tools left beside them. A spear point, a stone flake, a symbol cut into bark. It said, "This was ours. This was placed with intent. Come back later." In these signals, we see the faint beginnings of something more than survival. We see the origins of trust, of delayed gratification, of abstraction. Because caching isn't just putting food aside. It's believing the future will still need you, that the person you are today can feed the person you will be tomorrow. This temporal thinking, forward-reaching, backward recalling, is part of what made humans different. Most animals consume what they kill, but Ice Age humans learned to spread the bounty, not just among the group, but across time. It was an invisible sharing, one that transcended the immediate present. And it made them harder to kill, because even if the hunt failed tomorrow, the past might still feed them. So the land itself became a quiet ledger. What was placed? What was owed? What could be counted on, if all else fell away? And those who mastered this ledger, who cached wisely, who remembered clearly, outlasted those who didn't. They didn't just survive winter. They learned how to bend it. Some of the earliest evidence of this mastery can be found not in the bones of prey, but in the patterns of absence. At sites where you'd expect chaos, scattered remains, gnawed ends, frantic consumption, you instead find order. Bones placed deliberately, fire used sparingly, cuts made with economy. It suggests forethought, not desperation. People weren't eating everything at once. They were selecting, choosing what could wait. This included marrow-bearing bones, which, if not immediately needed, could be cached intact for later. In freezing conditions, a long bone wrapped in hide or buried under snow might keep its fat-rich contents edible for weeks. Similarly, organ meats, often the first to spoil, were either consumed rapidly or omitted altogether in planned caches. The goal wasn't just to save meat, but to save the right parts of it, the parts that would matter later. And so, Ice Age caching wasn't hoarding, it was engineering. A quiet kind of food architecture shaped by instinct, memory, and trial. And in this engineering we glimpse not only survival, but the beginnings of something like cuisine. Choices were made about flavor, texture, decay. Not everything was kept. Not everything was worth the risk. Some meats were buried deep, others high. Some were dried first, others left fresh. Each decision shaped the outcome. There were dangers, of course. Snowbanks could melt too early. Pits could be raided by wolves, wolverines, even other humans. Caches could be forgotten, misremembered, swallowed by flood or frost. And yet, the practice persisted across continents, from the mammoth steppes of Eurasia to the tundra of early North America. The same logic repeated again and again. Food placed carefully, retrieved later, always with intent, always with the trust that the cold would do its part. Sometimes the caching was accidental, the unintentional preservation of what was left behind. At the upper Paleolithic site of Yana, RHS in Siberia, frozen animal remains have been found in remarkably intact condition, suggesting not just the presence of meat, but its planned abandonment. Perhaps the group moved quickly. Perhaps they intended to return. Perhaps they did. We'll never know. But the meat stayed frozen, waiting beneath the ice, a meal for archaeologists tens of thousands of years later. And this is the paradox of Ice Age storage. It left little behind, yet everything it left tells a story. A snow-packed crevice is gone with the spring melt. A buried carcass rots to bone or vanishes entirely. But a change in the soil, a discoloration in the permafrost, a tool left beside a pit, these whisper of a logic deeper than instinct, a logic born of memory, of patience, of cold as ally. Because in a world without salt, without jars, without smoke, cold was the only tool that could stop time, and those who learned how to use it survived when others did not. In some places, this knowledge became a form of inheritance, not in words, but in actions. A son watching his father trace the shape of a pit. A hunter recalling the angle of a cave where wind could not reach. A gesture toward a slope, a buried memory, a shared understanding that here was where the past still waited. The frozen pantry was not a structure. It had no doors, no hinges, no smoke curling from a roof. But it had geography. It had rhythm. The best caching spots became known across generations, passed like myths, held like secrets. Not because people wanted to keep them from others, but because remembering them meant living. Some bands likely made annual returns to the same storage sites, checking for what had lasted, and what had been taken by weather, or animal, or misfortune. In this way, the land became a quiet calendar, each landmark tied to nourishment. Over time, the practice intertwined with broader foraging patterns. A kill was not only judged by its size, but by how much could be saved. A location was not only measured by how many animals passed through, but by how well it could conceal what was left behind. These decisions shaped migration, camp layout, even social structure. A group that could preserve food had more time to rest, to plan, to dream, and more time meant more capacity for culture. This is perhaps the most profound legacy of Ice Age refrigeration. It bought time. Time not spent scavenging every hour. Time not spent panicking after a failed hunt. Time to sit by the fire and mend a tool. Time to tell a story. Time to remember. And in that space, new ideas formed about seasons, about strategy, about life itself as something that could be shaped. We often think of prehistoric life as brutal and immediate, and in many ways, it was. But the humans who cached food were betting on tomorrow. They were envisioning a self that continued, a family that endured, a circle that would sit down again, days or weeks from now, to finish what had been started. They weren't just surviving, they were anticipating, and even in death, their planning lingered. Archaeologists have uncovered caches that were never reclaimed, frozen meals left uneaten, tools forgotten beside buried meat. Perhaps those who made them did not return. Perhaps they died, or migrated, or gave up the hunt entirely. But their intent remains visible in the soil, their logic preserved in the frost, their hope caught in the pause between hunger and plenty. Cold was not kind, but it was constant. And for a people with nothing but memory, instinct, and stone, that constancy could be shaped into something reliable, something life-giving, a pact with the frost, a promise that, if remembered, might just outlast the snow. When the hunger passed and the caches held, another need stirred, one not born of the body, but of the spirit. Humans did not only gather to eat, they gathered to mean, in firelit circles far older than temples. Long before agriculture or cities or laws, people came together not to survive, but to remember why survival mattered at all. Among hunter-gatherers, true feasting was rare. It was not a daily rhythm, but a rupture, a moment when the ordinary flow of effort and scarcity was interrupted by excess. A large kill, a good season, a shared migration. These were not just meals, they were events. When food became abundant, it also became symbolic. Each bite carried more than fat or protein. It carried status, gratitude, renewal. And when eaten together, that meaning multiplied. Across Ice Age sites, we find strange signs of this. Animal bones arranged with care. Fire pits larger than a family could need. Burned remnants of feasts held at the mouths of caves, on cliffs, or at river bends. These weren't just places of convenience. They were chosen, returned to, revered. In these spaces, food was not distributed evenly. Certain cuts went to certain people. Organs might be gifted, marrow might be reserved, and fat, always the rarest and most coveted, was shared last, like a closing blessing. What made these feasts powerful was not only the food, but the context. They broke routine. They marked time. A feast might follow a successful hunt, or a birth, or a death. It might coincide with the stars, or the return of a herd, or the first snowfall. Around the fire, hierarchy could bend. Elders told longer stories. Children were allowed to linger. Those who had wandered might return, and those who had stayed shared what they had kept. Symbolic foods often featured in these moments, not because of their taste or nutrition, but because of what they represented. A rare root pulled from deep earth, a smoked fish caught out of season, a strip of hide burned, not eaten. These items became tokens. Memory made edible. History passed hand to hand, bite to bite, and around all of it burned the fire, the original altar. In its glow, faces flickered, shadows danced on cave walls. Stories grew longer, voices softer. Fire gave shape to the night, and in doing so, gave form to the group. To feast was not only to eat, it was to become visible to each other, to confirm that we are still here and still together. This was the beginning of human ceremony, not in temples but in circles, not with incense but with smoke, not with robes but with grease-stained hands and bones laid bare. The feast was the first myth retold in flesh, a sacred return to meaning through meat, and at its center sat fat, not just as food, but as symbol. In a world where calories meant life and warmth meant survival, fat became sacred. It burned longer. It tasted richer. It sustained deeper. Shared fat was more than generosity. It was communion. A visceral acknowledgement that survival was not only individual but collective. To hand another person a morsel of fat was to say, "I see you. I want you to live." Anthropologists examining bones from Upper Paleolithic sites have noted butchery marks that suggest systematic fat harvesting not just from the expected places, but from the unexpected ones too. Eye sockets, joint capsules, vertebral spaces. These were not acts of gluttony. They were rituals of extraction, a precise choreography to ensure that nothing of value was lost. And when shared, the fat took on meaning beyond biology. In certain groups, it may have been offered to elders first, or to children in ritual order, or burned as a gift to the unseen. It is in this context that shared meals began to take on a narrative shape. The group didn't just eat, they performed. With the meat came memory. Around the flames, stories were not read from pages. They were sculpted from gesture, timing, and repetition. A hunter reenacted the stalk. A child mimicked the animal's fall. Laughter circled like smoke, and slowly the feast became a play, a telling, a ritual of what had happened and what it meant. Food became language, fat became rhythm, fire became stage. This might be the birth of myth, not as fiction, but as structure, a way to shape a chaotic world into something livable, to create meaning not because it was real, but because it was needed. In these first human gatherings, the distance between eating and storytelling dissolved. To chew was to remember, to taste was to belong, and to belong was to survive. Over time, certain foods may have become reserved for specific stories or events. A particular animal might only be eaten during migration. A certain root might be roasted during solstice. A dried strip of meat might be passed around in silence to honor the dead. These acts, repeated, became liturgy. And liturgy, repeated, became identity. Not all of this leaves marks in the archaeological record. But sometimes, it does. Charcoal layers deeper than habitation suggests fires not for warmth, but for gathering. Stone circles where no dwelling stood hint at meeting places, not homes. And bones split just so with no bite marks, no rush suggest meat eaten slowly, together, not in desperation, but in ceremony. In this light, Ice Age humans were not just foragers or hunters, they were keepers of memory, carriers of tradition, builders of temporary temples made of bone, ash, smoke, and story. And at the center of it all sat the food no longer just sustenance, but meaning made edible. This shift from meal to memory, from eating to enacting marked a quiet turning point in Ice Age life. For in the act of ritual feasting, the human band transformed from a survival unit into a cultural organism. The stories told around the fire were not only entertainment or instruction, they were glue, invisible, binding, and essential. Symbolic foods emerged within these gatherings. Not every bite carried the same weight. Some animals were remembered longer, spoken of in hushed tones. A mammoth might become more than a kill, it might become an ancestor. A bird's egg might be cracked in silence, symbolizing fertility or luck. A rare root might be offered to a pregnant woman first, in honor of birth. These acts may have been instinctive at first, but over time, they grew structured. What began as practical became sacred. Fat, again, held a central role. It was shaped into lamps, smeared on skin, rubbed into tools. In the right hands, it became a medium, a substance that could carry warmth, light, or protection or meaning. Archaeologists have found ochre mixed with animal fat, forming early paint. That paint, smeared or brushed across cave walls, told of hunts, spirits, migrations. Perhaps those pigments were made and shared during feasts. Perhaps they were applied as the stories were spoken. In that overlap of food, fire, and image, we glimpse the first outlines of identity, because to gather was to declare who you were, not just to the group, but to the world beyond it. A fire on the steppe was a signal of life, of alliance, of defiance against the cold. From afar, a glow in the dark said, "We are here. We have each other. We are more than hungry." And fire itself became more than heat. It became ritual, kept alive, tended carefully, moved from camp to campfire, was a kind of heartbeat. It marked the center of the group, the edge of safety, the axis of memory. Around it, old and young could share the same story, the same food, the same night. In these moments, prehistoric humans invented continuity. They created time not by clocks, but by returning to the same stories, the same feasts, the same circle. Each repetition carved deeper grooves in memory, and those grooves held identity long after the food was gone. So when we imagine the Ice Age diet, we must look beyond the calories, beyond the nutrients. We must see the gathering, the giving, the flicker of expression in a child's face as they hear a story their father once heard as a boy. These were not just meals, they were inheritances, and they laid the groundwork for something larger, still the birth of culture as survival, a truth not carried in blood, but in behavior, not stored in genes, but in gesture, and passed not through instinct, but through the quiet repetition of ritual and flame. Around the fire, memory lingered longer than smoke. In those glowing circles, the line between nourishment and narrative blurred. Every gesture, the way a piece of meat was carved, or fat was offered to an elder, became choreography. These were not mere customs. They were acts of identity. They told each person where they belonged, what was expected, and who would remember them. Feasts could mark transitions, the return of a hunt, the coming of age of a boy, the first shared food after loss. Each event etched new meaning into familiar ingredients. A bone might be passed around before cooking. A hide might be worn just once, then burned. Even silence had its place, broken only when a certain name was spoken or a specific tale begun. This rhythm of gesture and story kept groups coherent even across long migrations, even across the aching void of seasonal separation. And in this rhythm, fire was more than an element. It was a witness. It flickered and crackled and reached upward as if carrying stories into the dark. In many forager cultures, even today, fire is treated as a presence. It is spoken to, fed carefully, kept from dying. It watches. It remembers. We cannot know whether Ice Age people thought the same, but we know they placed fire at the center, and we know they gathered their stories there. These rituals also helped anchor the group in space. A feast site could become sacred, stones arranged just so, ash mounds that built up year by year, bones buried or left in patterns. When archaeologists stumble upon these sites tens of thousands of years later, they find more than the remnants of meals. They find meaning, deliberate placement, repetition, reverence, And in some of these feasts, we see the early fingerprints of hierarchy. Who sat closest to the fire? Who carved the meat? Who told the stories? And who merely listened? These small distinctions were not necessarily oppressive, but they were formative. They shaped the first outlines of roles. And in that shaping, they allowed the group to move together, to act with cohesion when danger came. Ritual gave structure. Structure gave survival. But ritual also gave something else. Something quieter. It gave beauty. Not beauty as decoration, but beauty as signal. A painted bone. A rhythm tapped on stone. A plume of scented smoke. These were ways of saying, we are more than hunger. We are more than cold. Even in this land of frost and death, we remember what joy feels like. To survive, they had to eat. But to live, truly live, they had to gather, to share, to speak, and in doing so, they turned food into firelight, and firelight into memory. These early feasts were not extravagant, but they were expansive. In them, the boundaries of self stretched outward. One man's kill was another child's nourishment. One woman's gathered roots became the glue of a group's cohesion. A single shared meal could carry the scent of forgiveness, or hope, or return. The emotional gravity of food extended beyond its nutrients. In those circles, meat was not just chewed, it was offered. And in the offering, trust was built. What we call ritual was not always solemn. Laughter had a place too. Teasing, playful boasts about who hunted what, imitations of animals around the fire, performed for the joy of children. These were not distractions. They were anchors. In the Ice Age, where death was a familiar face and hunger a frequent guest, joy was resistance. It was a declaration that something inside still burned, even when everything outside froze. Symbolic foods, the fatty marrow of a mammoth, the roasted heart of a hare, the first berry of the season, were not chosen by accident. These were not only edible, they were meaningful. They marked time, honored absence, invited blessing. We see it in cave art too. Animals rendered not for realism, but reverence. Sometimes pierced with spears, sometimes painted with care. Perhaps those animals were not just prey. They were part of the same breath, the same exchange, the same fire-lit memory. And fire itself was transformative in more ways than one. It softened roots. It seared flesh. But it also gave food its rhythm. Meals became predictable, structured, safe. That predictability allowed the mind to wander, to imagine, to dream aloud. Around the fire, people didn't just feed bodies. They fed imaginations. And in those imaginations, stories were born. Not just about the past, but about what could come next. A hunt not yet taken, a land not yet crossed, a child not yet born. These stories were not written, but they were remembered, and when shared through meals, they became part of the food itself. A piece of meat handed across the fire might carry with it a name, a warning, a wish. In that way, every bite sustained more than muscle. It sustained memory. The Ice Age was not just survived by tools or fire or instinct. It was survived by the quiet warmth of presence. The act of turning scarcity into ceremony. The ability to turn eating into meaning. Somewhere in the ancient cold, a group of people once sat together in a circle of embers, passing around a carved bone, a charred root, a story. They did not know what would become of their world, but for a moment, they shared it. And in that moment, they became human. But humanity was never a finished state. It shifted with the land, reshaped by each new climate, each vanishing beast, each returning plant. When the Ice Age softened its grip, and the white horizon receded into mist and bloom, survival changed flavor. What once was hunted now had to be gathered. What once ran now ripened. The glaciers, retreating like old memories, exposed ground not seen for tens of thousands of years, and from that soil came berries, roots, and edible leaves. On the shores, the tide whispered of shellfish, of salt, of a different kind of nourishment. This was not just a new menu, it was a new test. The old knowledge of fat and flesh did not vanish, but it was no longer enough. A hunter who could track mammoths might starve in a berry-rich forest if he could not tell ripe from ruin. A clan that once followed reindeer into open tundra now had to know which shellfish to pluck, which tide to trust, which red fruit could kill a child in an hour. The world had changed its offerings, and humans had to learn its new grammar. Ecosystems were in flux. Birch and hazel crept across the warming plains. Wetlands spread. The edge of the ice, once the edge of life, moved north, and with it the animals, the birds, and the human bands who followed them. But some stayed. Some adapted. The traces are still found in ancient shell middens, heaps of discarded clam and mussel shells that built up over generations. There, in those quiet piles of calcium and ash, lie the signatures of a new way of eating, of living, a way that required more than strength. It required attention. Berry grounds were remembered like sacred texts, passed down through seasons and stories. The place where the salmon run fattened, the exact grove where the sweetest elderberries grew after the second frost. Children were taught not only how to walk through a forest, but how to listen to it, to read its signs, because danger had changed too. It now came not only in claws or teeth, but in toxins hidden behind sweetness, in mushrooms that mirrored their safe cousins, in roots that fed, and roots that burned. And yet the promise of food was closer, more constant. For those who could read the land's new rhythm, there were meals to be had in nearly every season. Not grand feasts, perhaps, but sustaining mouthfuls, berries crushed into paste, shellfish roasted on hot stones, wild greens boiled with a careful hand. These were foods of trust, of intimacy with place, and they asked something different of those who gathered them. Not the charge of the hunt, but the patience of presence, the willingness to stay still long enough to be fed by a forest rather than chasing life across it. That was not weakness, it was transformation. In the hum of insects and the rustle of wind through trees, humans began to build a different kind of memory, a memory rooted not in the flight of prey, but in the slow ripening of fruit. This quiet attentiveness shaped the post-glacial diet, not just as a matter of calories, but as a way of knowing the world. Shell middens tell the story clearly. Along ancient coastlines and estuaries, these heaps of broken shells, fish bones, and charred wood rise like low tombs of a different kind of hunt, the harvest of tide and time. In Europe, sites like Ertebel in Denmark preserve the remnants of a shoreline life. Oysters, cockles, fish remains, bird bones, even scattered tools shaped for scraping and prying. They speak of repeated return, of seasonal rhythm. These were not the leftovers of a single feast. They were layered archives of survival, layered like the shells themselves year after year, generation after generation, small meals adding up to a way of life. And inland, berry grounds took on similar meaning. Lingonberries, crowberries, elderberries, each with its own season, its own habitat, its own lesson. To a modern eye, they might seem trivial, the kind of snack that fits between real meals. But in a world without certainty, without storage, without the luxury of bulk berries were medicine, sugar, vitamin, and sometimes the only taste of sweetness a child might know all year. These foods shaped movement. Just as the mammoth trail once dictated the path of the hunt, so too did the berry thicket and the mussel shore begin to shape human travel. Temporary camps became semi-permanent. Return sites were remembered and passed down, and in this remembering, culture deepened. The land was no longer just a canvas for pursuit, it became a partner in a quieter dance. But it was not without risk. Shellfish spoiled fast. Some, like certain clams, could harbor toxins during algae blooms, toxins no eye could see. And berries, too, wore disguises. Red could mean sugar or poison. Mushrooms offered no second chances. Children learned this through story, but also through loss. These lessons were not written in books, but in absences. In the child who did not return. in the elder who warned with a story whose details never quite matched but always ended the same way. Still, people learned. The forests fed, the coasts gave. The new world after the ice was not gentler, it was simply more intricate. The great beasts had vanished or moved on. In their place came countless smaller gifts. To accept them meant listening longer, waiting deeper, and when the moment was right, reaching out with hands that no longer held spears, but baskets. That was not just a change in diet, it was a change in tempo. The post-glacial world demanded a different kind of survival logic. In the age of megafauna, food had been fast, rare, dangerous. But now, nourishment came in smaller portions, more frequent, more varied. And that meant the human body and mind had to shift with it. Not just to survive, but to notice. Climate rhythms no longer meant only ice and thaw. They now brought rains that reshaped rivers, warmed forests into unfamiliar growth, and coaxed new species into being. Birch, hazel, older trees that had once been pushed back by permafrost now reached higher and farther. And beneath them, whole food webs rewrote themselves. Animals changed migration routes. Insects adapted. Edible plants appeared in new places, at new times, in strange cycles. What had once been reliable became unpredictable, and that unpredictability meant people had to become trackers not just of hoofprints, but of time itself. Phenology, the study of seasonal change, was lived, not theorized. You knew when to look for elderberries, not by a calendar, but by the blooming of a flower upstream. You knew the best shellfish tides by the nesting of a coastal bird. These were patterns passed mouth to ear, across long twilights by the fire. Stories became maps. Songs became guides. And children learned to survive not just by strength or speed, but by remembering when the world would turn. In some regions, this meant diversification. Where once the band might have focused solely on bison or elk, now a broader strategy emerged: mixed gathering, flexible foraging, mobile knowledge. A family might eat fish one day, roots the next, eggs the day after, and in that mix, a buffer formed. One failed source didn't mean starvation. Risk was spread like seeds in the wind, but with this came a more complex danger. Not hunger, but misjudgment. In a world of new foods, trial and error was inevitable. Some plants cured fevers, others stopped hearts. Some mushrooms opened the mind, others never let it close again. And so, the dance between food and medicine began to blur. A bitter root could be both meal and cure, depending on dose and season. An infusion of bark might soothe a wound or cause one. There was no sharp line between harm and help. There was only memory, ritual, and instinct. This blurred line also softened roles. As women, elders, and children became the primary gatherers of these delicate foods, knowledge shifted into new hands. Expertise was no longer only in the hunter's throw, but in the forager's eye. And in that eye lived a different kind of power, the kind that saw not what ran, but what waited, what grew, what returned. This was the power of pattern memory, a deep intuition, trained not through confrontation, but through stillness. Post-glacial foragers developed a different kind of strength, one rooted in attentiveness, repetition, and seasonal return. They knew that the ripening of certain berries depended not only on temperature, but on the subtle dance of shade, moisture, and time. A patch of elderberries might be perfect one year and poisonous the next, altered by unseen fungal shifts or shifts in animal behavior. To gather food was to walk through a layered web of timing, knowledge, and restraint. Shellfish offered a similar paradox. Coastal groups discovered that these slow-moving creatures could feed many, but only if harvested wisely. Over-harvest a beach, and it would yield nothing the next year. Eat the wrong shellfish after a red tide, and the meal could turn deadly. So middens grew ancient piles of discarded shells, not as waste, but as records. These mounds told stories of diet, of rhythm, of community choices stretching back generations. Some reached meters high, spanning centuries. Each shell a quiet entry in the human calendar of change. For inland people, berries became a mirror of shifting ecosystems. As forests replaced tundra, new berry types emerged, some edible, some not. Blueberries, cranberries, lingonberries, and sloe grew in overlapping pockets, shaped by altitude, soil, and animal dispersal. Bears and humans often competed for the same fruit, and foragers had to move with care, aware not only of taste and nutrition, but of scent trails and risks. A single misstep could turn a quiet gathering into a fatal encounter. And so, silence became a skill. The art of moving without warning the forest. Through it all, food remained a compass. Berries and shellfish were not luxuries, but signs. Signs that the ice had retreated, that the land was breathing differently, that time itself had opened into a new kind of survival. These were foods that didn't require fire, didn't require strength, didn't even require tools. They required patience, presence, precision, and in return, they offered something rare in the Ice Age world: continuity. For those who remembered when the sea was frozen and the wind cut through mammoth hide, this new menu came with mixed feelings. There was warmth, yes, abundance, sometimes, but also unpredictability. The old skills hunting, caching, tracking were no longer enough. Survival now depended on sensing subtleties, reading leaf curl, watching bloom time, tasting without swallowing, trusting that nature had not only teeth, but whispers. And that to eat, you first had to listen. For Ice Age survivors, entering this unfamiliar, greening world, listening became a deeper form of learning. The forest spoke not through volume, but through variation: the appearance of new mosses on stones, the shifting call of birds that once never flew this far north. Each change was a clue. The presence of certain mushrooms meant a specific tree nearby. A shift in bird migration might signal the fruiting of a particular grove. Where food once meant force, now it required fluency, not in language, but in environment. Shell middens, berry paths, pollen layers in lakebed mud, all of these tell us, today, that people were not simply reacting to a new ecosystem, they were mastering it. And mastery did not mean control. It meant being attuned, knowing when not to pick, when to wait, when to leave the last few clams in the sand, so that the sea, too, could replenish. This was a quieter phase of survival, but no less vital. It demanded a different kind of mind, one that could hold patterns across seasons, one that could remember what a parent or grandparent had taught, even if that knowledge came only once a year, and only for a week. These new foods were not hunted, they emerged, and only those who knew where to be, and when, could claim them. Evidence from sites like Ohalo II in Israel, or Mesolithic camps across the Atlantic coasts of Europe, show this adaptation in motion. Seeds, nuts, fish bones, and berry remains fill ancient hearths and pits. These were not scraps. They were deliberate choices. Men and women who once hunted reindeer across tundra now built baskets for gathering. They returned to the same coastal rocks where mussels could be pried loose. They began to notice which plants healed, which harmed, which gave both hunger and medicine in equal measure. And slowly, something changed in the human relationship with food. It became less of a chase and more of a dialogue. This wasn't farming, not yet, but it was the seed of it, a willingness to wait, a recognition that the land had its own calendar, its own cadence. And if you matched it, you might not only eat, you might endure. The post-glacial diet was not a single menu, but a mosaic. Different foods, different rhythms, different risks. But all of them pulled from a deeper well of awareness. Ice Age humans did not just survive change. They ate their way through it. One berry, one shell, one season at a time. And in the quiet intervals between hunger and harvest, something grew beyond muscle or memory. A sense that the world itself could offer more than struggle. That the land could speak softly, and that sometimes the softest voice fed the deepest strength. But not every voice was gentle. Some whispered warnings in bitter taste. Some lied, blooming with color only to bring pain. In this next age of survival, as the forests thickened and the rivers ran warmer, food was no longer just about meat or marrow. It was about trust and risk. The human body, shaped by millennia of hunting, now had to become a chemist, a botanist, an experimenter with skin and gut as the testing ground. There were no labels, no recipes, just instinct, memory, and the consequences of curiosity. A child might nibble a strange leaf and fall sick. A mother might chew a root during labor and feel the pain recede. A group might brew a bark in water and find their fever break. These lessons were paid in blood, breath, and time, and passed down not in words, but in watching, in tasting, in remembering what came after. Ancient humans lived in landscapes thick with potential and peril. The same plant that nourished could also numb. The same mushroom that cured could kill. There was no clear line between food and medicine, between meal and mistake. And yet, somehow, people learned. They marked which plants opened wounds and which closed them, which could be eaten raw and which needed to be buried in ash, which could calm a mind broken by grief, or quicken the blood when strength was gone. What emerged was not a science as we know it, but something older, a deep-time intelligence encoded in tradition. At sites like Shanidar Cave in Iraq, pollen from medicinal herbs like yarrow and ephedra have been found in Neanderthal graves, suggesting knowledge not just of healing, but of honoring. To leave the dead with herbs is to say, "You mattered, even now." And to those still living, it whispered, "This plant helps. Use it again." Across continents, similar stories unfolded. In the forests of Ice Age Europe, humans learned to peel the bark of willow, unknowingly drawing out salicylates, a compound not unlike aspirin. In colder regions, mosses were packed into wounds. In the humid tropics, where diversity exploded, the number of known remedies likely stretched into the hundreds. And all of it, every salve, every brew, every careful trial was survival. And yet, this was not a sterile knowledge. It was visceral, learned by chewing, by steeping, by dying, by watching what the animals ate, by seeing which leaves insects avoided. It was a choreography of risk, one that humans danced through every time they touched a new berry, a new bark, a new bloom. No other species gambled so much on so little. But none were as good at learning from the consequences. What could not be digested by one became a remedy for another. What tasted foul might clear the lungs. What dulled the tongue might dull the pain. And slowly, across thousands of years, a wild pharmacopoeia formed, written not on paper, but in bloodlines and breath, in the gut, where instinct lived, where every decision meant either nourishment or nausea. Each new plant carried the weight of ancestral trials, the hidden calculus of who had tried it before and what had happened after. There was no universal menu, only local vocabularies of survival, etched into the behaviors of each band, each biome. What grew beside a river in Ice Age Asia might be unknown to a hunter on the Atlantic coast. And yet everywhere, humans tuned themselves to the patterns of edibility. Trial was constant, error unforgiving. But over time, something else evolved, not just fear or memory, but a kind of intuition. A learned sensitivity to bitter alkaloids, a bodily resistance to low doses of toxins. The liver became a frontline defense. Saliva and stomach acid sharpened into tools not just of digestion, but discernment. A taste could warn. A smell could signal. The senses became scouts. And still, mistakes were made. Some people died from a single bite. Others grew sick and lived to warn the rest. Children, elders, the curious they became, both the victims and the vectors of new knowledge. In the foraging mind, risk was unavoidable. But it was also data. If something caused dreams, or dizziness, or the loosening of pain, it was remembered, marked. Stored not in books, but in rituals, in stories told around the fire, in what was gathered and what was left behind. Among these remembered plants were the mushrooms' strange fruiting bodies that seemed neither plant nor animal. Some brought visions, some brought death. Others simply filled the stomach in a lean season. The fine line between poison and power blurred here more than anywhere else, and yet people learned how to dry them, how to test a portion, how to pair them with fat or ash. It wasn't chemistry as we define it, but it was something older, a practical alchemy of taste and trust. Herbs too had their place. Mint to cool the mouth, sage to burn in smoke, bitter roots to cleanse or purge. What began as instinct deepened into culture. Plants became offerings. Leaves were placed on wounds, not only to heal but to comfort. The smell of certain barks came to mean recovery, or protection, or peace. To eat was no longer a private act. It became a shared practice of knowing what could be taken and what must be respected. And always, there was overlap. A tuber that staved off hunger might also ease inflammation. A flower that flavored meat might also soothe a cough. Ancient humans didn't separate food from medicine the way we do. They couldn't afford to. Everything that entered the body was evaluated by the same standard. Does this keep us alive? Does it help us stay out through another storm, another winter, another wound? This question, repeated for generations, refined a survival instinct that wasn't just practical. It was spiritual. Because to trust a plant was to trust the land, and to survive the land was to belong to it. Belonging meant listening, watching how animals fed, which leaves the deer avoided, which berries birds returned to, which roots the boars unearthed. The forest and steppe became more than backdrop, they became mentors. Bears taught us not to touch certain mushrooms. Ravens led us to edible caches. Insects clustered around rot, but also around sweetness. Even spoilage had its signals. The land whispered, if you knew how to look. If you knew when not to touch. Children learned early. Not through lectures, but through example. A mother would chew a leaf and grimace, and the child would never forget. A grandfather would boil a bark and sip its bitterness until the fever broke. These weren't lessons. They were moments. Medicine passed not through formulas, but through gestures, rituals, patterns of trust. Fire was a purifier. Ash was an antidote. Water could dilute or amplify. What we now call pharmacology began as a dance between the senses and the soil. There were no instructions, but there were warnings. A berry that stained the mouth black, a sap that numbed the tongue, a root that made the hands shake. Across continents and climates, humans developed systems of caution. Red often meant danger, but not always. Some poisons only harmed in certain seasons, others only after rain. The knowledge was cumulative, but fragile. It had to be preserved not in permanent ink, but in repeated practice. In story, in song, many of the most powerful plants were not staples. They were tools of transformation. Psychedelics, purges, painkillers. Their use was rare, ceremonial, guarded by elders or healers. These plants could make a man see gods or see death. The line between healing and hallucination was not always clear, but the goal was survival, insight, control over what the body could not otherwise master: hunger, fear, illness, loss. Sometimes, plants were tested not on humans, but on the dying. An elder with little time might try a new brew, and if it worked, the knowledge lived on. If not, it ended quietly, folded into the silence of the fire. These were not ethical experiments by modern standards, but they were experiments born of necessity. The need to know, the need to help, the need to find one more edge against nature's indifference. And so, a catalogue of plant knowledge grew, unspoken and sprawling. A memory woven through generations, carried in bundles of herbs tied to belts, tucked into baskets, crushed into pastes, boiled into teas. Plants were not separate from life, they were embedded in it. They flavored the first meals. They clothed wounds and warded spirits. They taught caution and gave comfort. To eat was to decide, to chew was to test, to heal was to gamble. And every bite was a story, one that began in the roots and ended in the body, if you were lucky. Luck, however, was never enough. The deeper truth of ancient plant use is that even wisdom could not guarantee safety. Plants changed. Their potency shifted with soil, weather, and maturity. A leaf that nourished one year might kill the next. A mushroom that healed in spring could poison in fall. This uncertainty birthed not only caution, but ritual. Before consumption came silence. Breath. A pause to ask the land not for permission but for mercy. Those who knew the plants, truly knew them, carried a kind of burden. They were the ones summoned when a child convulsed after chewing the wrong stem. They were the ones who ground roots in the dark, whispering to their mixtures like prayers. Often, their knowledge was not admired, it was feared, misunderstood. The line between healer and witch, between wisdom and witchcraft, was never clear in the Ice Age world. But the danger they danced with was real. Herbs that dulled pain were sometimes the same that stilled the heart. Roots that stopped bleeding could also stop breathing. The same bark might calm a fever or induce a sleep from which there was no waking. These dualities were not seen as flaws in nature. They were respected as part of its design. Every plant had its moment, its measure, its mystery. Use it right, and it gave life. Use it wrong, and it claimed it. So knowledge became sacred. Passed through initiations, kept close, never spoken lightly. In some groups, a plant's name was not uttered aloud, only gestured or sung in symbolic tones. This was not superstition, it was survival protocol. The wrong plant in the wrong hands could collapse a lineage, and so Ice Age bands developed unspoken codes of apprenticeship. Watching was permission. Touching was trust. Preparing was initiation. Giving that was mastery. And still, some knowledge was simply lost. Droughts erased habitats. Migration shifted diets. A child died before telling what he saw his mother mix. A healer fell in silence, carrying decades of plant lore into the earth. These moments were mourned not only for the person, but for the vanishing of understanding. The plants remained, but the relationships faded, and with every forgotten leaf, humanity's margin of survival grew thinner. In some places, this loss was fought with ritual redundancy. A child might be made to observe the preparation of a single remedy hundreds of times, until it flowed through muscle memory. A mistake in dosage wasn't a slip. It was a death sentence. Precision was inherited, not taught. And the graveyard of prehistory is full of those whose education came too late. But from those who endured, the line of knowledge stretched forward, not through written texts or permanent archives, but through rhythm, through taste, through instinct, through the feel of a leaf's underside in moonlight, through the way a bitter root lingered on the tongue just long enough to be remembered, through the strange and sacred intimacy between hunger, healing, and harm. And it was here, in the liminal space between cure and curse, that a new kind of intelligence emerged, not the intelligence of tools or traps, but of trust in the body's quiet signals. Numbness on the tongue, heat in the stomach, dizziness behind the eyes. These were not just symptoms. They were messages, a language of the gut, older than speech, telling the mind what the earth was trying to say. Every bite became a test, every meal an experiment. And the men and women who dared to taste what had not been tasted before they were the front line of biological discovery. Their courage was not always recognized. Often, it was born from desperation. But what they found, and sometimes survived, became the foundation of our future diets, our medicines, and our mythologies. Consider the bitter plants that today fill pharmacies. Aspirin's ancestor grew in Ice Age meadows, chewed by hunters with swollen joints. Antiseptics lived in bark long before boiling water. Hallucinogens, too, played a role not for escape, but for vision, for guidance, for dreaming a path through hunger, for entering the realm where ancestors might whisper what the waking world would not say. But even more common were the quiet plants, the ones with no ceremony, no trance, only slow restoration, the ones that soothed the gut after bad meat, that dulled the edge of infection, that softened the fevered child through a night of uncertainty. These were not magical, they were mundane, and yet their power shaped generations. And there were those that walked the boundary foods that became poisons unless handled with care, tubers that had to be soaked, seeds that needed roasting, mushrooms that could be eaten only if the cap was split and the flesh turned blue. These rules weren't written. They were felt, passed through stories, scars, and the taste memory of survivors. What is remarkable is not only that prehistoric humans learned these things, but that they remembered them. In a world where forgetting killed, memory became the most valuable nutrient of all. And so children were taught not just what to eat, but how it felt, what heat behind the eyes meant, what sweat on the neck foretold, what flavor hinted at danger, and which aftertaste meant relief. This is where healing and harm braided together, not in opposition, but in rhythm, in understanding that balance was not about purity, but about proportion, that even the deadliest plant could heal, and even the mildest root could kill, if used wrongly. And so they walked the line, cautiously, gratefully, aware that the earth was not generous or cruel, but indifferent. It was up to them to listen well enough to survive, and that listening became its own kind of legacy. A song not sung aloud, but hummed beneath breath. A recipe not measured in weight, but in weather and moonlight. A medicine cabinet not made of bottles, but of forests. Still waiting, still whispering, still alive. Yet, survival often depended on more than the whisper. It demanded motion. It asked not only what you could find, but what you could carry. Across frozen plains, up wind-raked ridges, through snowdrift and time, the hunter was never home for long. So food became a question of endurance, not feasting, but fuel, not taste, but time, and what he brought had to last. Dried meat was among the oldest answers. Stripped thin and stretched taut under sun or smoke, it lost moisture but kept strength. A slice of mammoth muscle, once too heavy to haul, became light as bark and just as dry. Caribou, horse, wild sheep each could be rendered into long-lasting strips of jerky. Salt was not yet known, not in the way later civilizations would use it, but dryness itself was a weapon against rot. It turned the meat into memory, into momentum. More than meat, it was fat that gave these foods their fire. Rendered from marrow, boiled from bone shards, or scraped from the hides of kill sites, animal fat became the portable gold of the hunter's world. It could be wrapped in hide, tucked into bone tubes, sealed in stomach pouches. Fat was warmth, endurance, and brain fuel. It burned longer than sugar, steadier than flesh. In some traditions, it was packed with dried berries or pulverized meat into something more pemmican. A complete meal in a fist-sized lump. Not delicious, not light, but life-giving. These weren't just foods, they were tools, packed with purpose. The man who left camp with a spear and nothing to eat might come back as a story, or not at all. But the one who tucked a pouch of rendered fat, a sliver of dried meat, a hollowed-out antler with smoked berries inside, he was planning not just for the next kill, but for the days between, for when nothing moved across the snow, for when the trail went cold. Even bones became tools of nourishment. Hollowed and sealed, they could carry grease. Used as ladles, they scooped fat from fire pits. Carved with notches, they became portion measures, the first echoes of rationing. In the Ice Age, nutrition was not guesswork. It was a choreography of calories. What you ate, when, and how often were decisions that shaped who lived and who faded. Efficiency mattered because the distances were unforgiving. A successful hunt might lie 3 valleys away. Carrying back a full carcass was not always possible. But a concentrated pack of fat and protein, light, durable, ready, that was possible. That was planning. And planning, in the deep cold, was the real difference between cleverness and extinction. So they packed their meals like they packed their tools. Not for comfort, not for ceremony, but for consequence. Because when your path curved into white silence and nothing stirred but wind, what you carried decided what would carry you. And what they carried had to fit inside a world measured not in kilometers, but in blisters, frostbite, and the space between kill sites. Mobility was survival, and survival meant trimming excess down to essence. No spare weight, no wasted motion, just what the body demanded and the terrain allowed. Hunters learned to ration by instinct, not appetite. A sliver of dried meat tucked in a pouch wasn't just lunch. It was warmth 2 hours from now, clarity at the moment of the throw, strength to drag the carcass home. They learned to chew slowly, to let the fibers unravel across the tongue. Hunger was never fully silenced, only negotiated with. To move efficiently, they adapted their food into forms that could survive the jostle of pursuit. Fat packs wrapped in hide could be stored in the folds of a belt or under fur layers to prevent freezing. Some groups pounded bone marrow into raw meat before drying it, creating compact, nutrient-dense slabs. Others rendered fat into a tallow that could be consumed in small chunks or mixed with dried fish powder. Every community found its own calculus of nourishment, dictated not by preference, but by landscape. Even the tools they used for preparing and storing food on the move were shaped by minimalism. Sharpened stone flakes replaced heavier cutting tools. Hollow bones became scoops, funnels, and containers. Strips of sinew tied up packets of jerky like prehistoric twine. Some hunters carried leather slings not just for weapons, but for food worn cross-body, resting near the heart, warming the fat within. There was a quiet intelligence to this system. It was not flashy, not ornamental, but it was tested, refined, and passed down through generations. Boys learned by watching older men unwrap food parcels with practiced hands. They learned how much meat a journey demanded, how long a dried fish would last, how to guess fat spoilage by smell alone. There was no waste, because waste meant hunger, and hunger was always too close. The act of packing for a hunt became a ritual of preparation, not just of tools, but of mind. It was a moment to review the risks, to think about distance, direction, and weather. Each pouch of food was a reminder: you may not return today, or tomorrow. You may have to outlast the trail. And so, these meals on the move became more than fuel. They were trust, encoded in flesh and grease. Trust that you'd made the right cuts, chosen the right portions, planned well enough to come back. Because in the Ice Age, a man could live 3 days on what he carried or die 1 day short. The difference wasn't luck. It was what you thought to bring when the snow began to fall, and what you chose to leave behind. There is something ancient in that decision, that weighing of burdens, that quiet audit of need. Before the hunt, men knelt not to pray, but to pack. They folded dried meat into hide satchels, sealed rendered fat in stitched bladders, lashed tools beside food in a calculus of survival. To bring too little was to starve. To bring too much was to slow. You had to know your limits. You had to know the land. Among the earliest hunters, we find signs of this minimalist strategy etched into the bones of their prey and the wear on their own. Reindeer femurs stripped of every trace of fat. Mammoth sinew turned into cordage. The evidence does not speak of abundance. It speaks of discipline. A man on the trail was not indulging in meals. He was outlasting time. And time, in the Ice Age, was stretched thin. Days could disappear in snow. Tracks vanished. Winds rose. The sun was only a weak suggestion. The further from camp you went, the more every gram of food became a tether to life. Jerky wasn't just meat. It was memory of the kill, the fire, the hands that dried it. Every bite told a story of preparation. These hunting meals, if they could even be called meals, were survival distillates, concentrated forms of energy, engineered by experience. Pemmican, the mix of dried meat, powdered fat, and sometimes berries, was not a luxury. It was innovation. It allowed calories to travel. It turned a seasonal kill into a tool that could cross terrain and time. Some groups even buried food caches in cold earth along their migratory routes, like messages to a future self. A man who left behind a sealed pit of fat-stuffed marrow bones was not being generous. He was planning for his own exhaustion. He was making sure the return journey did not become a death march. This way of thinking of future hunger, of portable nourishment, marked a shift in cognition. It required projection, strategy, and trust in one's memory. It also reinforced social bonds. Food was sometimes divided before the hunt began. with clear expectations of who would carry what, and how it would be shared if plans changed. To take more than your share was not just rude, it was dangerous. Hunting in the Ice Age was not just about spears and skill. It was logistics, as intimate as skin. It was knowing how to hide fat under your belt so it wouldn't freeze. It was knowing when to chew and when to save. It was knowing how to turn meat into time, and how to stretch that time across uncertainty. In the depths of winter, nothing guaranteed the return of game. The mammoths could shift their routes. The reindeer might not come. Even the fish, once reliable in thaw, could vanish beneath the ice. And so men became curators of calories, crafting not just meals but strategies, rehearsing scenarios in their minds before stepping into the white unknown. Tools were not only for the kill, they were for the keeping. Flint scrapers sliced sinew thin enough to dry on wooden racks. Stone bowls, when available, were used to render fat into a soft, portable balm. Fire-hardened sticks stirred marrow into paste, sealed in bladders, buried in cold soil to keep it safe. This wasn't cooking. This was engineering, and it was deeply collaborative. Preparing hunting food was rarely the work of one man alone. Around the fire, hands moved in practiced rhythm, some slicing, others packing, others binding small packets with fiber twine. The same hands that once threw spears now folded nourishment into bundles, their fingers reading the landscape in calories. To fail in this preparation was to waste the hunt. To succeed was to survive the next absence. Even the wrapping of food had layers of meaning. Hide, bark, and leaf were not chosen at random. Some materials helped prevent freezing, others made it easier to strap the food to a belt, or to stow it beneath layered clothing. The ideal pack was silent, light, and long-lasting. It would not rustle. It would not rot. It would not be found by scavengers if hidden well. Mobility was everything. A hunter could not afford to be slowed by bulk. Every object, even the food, had to justify its place. And so pemmican became more than food. It became culture. It was the earliest sign that humans understood rationing not as scarcity, but as structure. Each portion was a promise not just of nourishment, but of foresight. There were rituals to the eating too. Some hunters shared the first bite in silence before a long trail. Others waited until a high ridge had been crossed before allowing themselves a sliver. The act of eating became a marker of milestones, a ceremony of persistence. In this way, food tracked time without clocks. It marked distance without maps. And when the journey grew long, and the weather turned cruel, those simple packages of dried meat and stored fat became more than sustenance. They became reminders of the ones who waited back at camp, of the hunts that had succeeded, of the minds that had planned far enough ahead to give you this moment. The hunter might have been alone on the trail, but he was never truly alone in that bite, because what he carried was shaped not just by hunger, but by memory. That strip of dried meat had once hung above a communal fire, turned slowly by the same hands that carved bone beads or stitched boots from hide. The fat tucked in a pouch beside it had been rendered down while songs were sung or stories passed between generations. These were not anonymous rations. They were crafted artifacts of survival, forged from kinship and time. Every tool that enabled this, the scraper, the knife, the wrap, the sling, bore the signature of use. Handles smoothed by calloused palms, blades rechipped and resharpened until they resembled nothing like their original form, except in function. Some were etched with notches, perhaps counting days or kills. Others were left plain, worn almost to nothing but still reliable. These were the ancestors of our lunchboxes, our backpacks, our logistical maps. They were portable continuity. It's easy to imagine the hunter now pacing across tundra, wind in his ears, ice beneath his feet, chewing slowly, not just on the meat but on the meaning. For every bite had a cost. Something had died. Someone had skinned and stripped it. Others had prepared it, planned for it, stored it. That act of eating, even when alone, was deeply social, and the environment demanded this level of planning. In the cold, energy burned fast. Muscles demanded warmth. A body walking across snow burned more than it could afford. The wrong meal, or no meal, could spiral into collapse. Shivering cost calories. Resting offered little without reserves. But the right food, eaten at the right time, could restore clarity, stabilize motion, pull the mind back from fear. These packs weren't just practical, they were mental anchors. A reminder that life was not always this hard, or that others had survived worse. That somewhere ahead, if the trail held, warmth waited. A camp, a fire, a voice, a story, and so the food kept moving, across ice, through forests, over ridges. It crossed rivers and snowfields, and generations. And while none of it remains intact today, no jerky has survived the millennia. No pouch of fat lies waiting in the loam its logic has endured. Even now, we prepare for journeys. We portion out our strength. We pack, we ration, we remember. We carry what matters. And if you look closely enough at the trail of history, through the ancient campsites and the butchered bones and the charred stones of old fires, you'll see it. The silhouette of a man walking forward, pack at his side, strength in his stride, and the taste of yesterday still feeding tomorrow. But behind that silhouette, there was a flicker, not of movement, of fire. Long before agriculture, long before villages, long before maps or alphabets, there was the hearth, a controlled burn, a glowing circle at the center of memory. Fire did more than warm. It transformed. It took what was raw and made it safe. It took what was tough and made it tender. It turned chewing into digesting, waiting into bonding, instinct into culture. The theory is called the cooking hypothesis, and it begins not with pots and recipes but with ash and meat. Around 2 million years ago, something shifted. Homo erectus, leaner and longer-limbed than its predecessors, began to show signs of a brain growing larger than any before, not just in size, but in complexity. This didn't happen because we found better food. It happened because we started changing it. Cooking breaks down fibers. It softens roots. It neutralizes toxins. A raw tuber might cost hours of chewing, delivering little energy. A roasted one, charred in embers, offered warmth and sustenance in far less time. That saved time didn't just mean more meals. It meant more moments to think, plan, connect. And the brain, always hungry, noticed. Brains are expensive organs. They demand more fuel than any other tissue. For our ancestors to afford them, something had to give. Cooking, by pre-processing food outside the body, offloaded some of digestion's burden. The gut shrank, the jaw lightened, the teeth changed, and the mind expanded. But fire didn't just alter biology. It reshaped time. It stretched the day. Instead of sleeping with sundown, groups lingered around the coals. There was light to see, warmth to share, a reason to stay close. And in that lingering came language, laughter, planning, memory. Fire made it possible to speak not just about the hunt, but about things that hadn't happened yet, or things too big to see gods, spirits, dreams. Cooking also created trust. Food was now communal, no longer scavenged alone or gnawed in secret. It was roasted, split, handed around. That gesture, the passing of something warm, may have been one of the first true signs of humanity. It said, "You are part of this." And with each shared bite, bonds deepened. What emerged from the hearth was not just nutrition, it was identity. A band that cooked together became more than just a group of bodies avoiding starvation. They became a unit with rhythm, with memory, with ritual. And when the fire died down and the night grew cold, the warmth lingered not just in the stomach, but in the stories. Because every flicker of flame fed more than flesh. It fed thought. It fed feeling. It fed the future. And with that future came time stretched, segmented, and softened by firelight. In a world where every minute once bristled with survival, fire gave our ancestors the rarest of luxuries, a pause. The kind of pause where children could sit and listen, where elders could speak. where silence could stretch long enough to become meaning. This was not just about food preparation, it was time preparation. Moments carved out not to flee or forage, but to learn, remember, connect. The hearth became a metronome for human rhythm. Not the rushing beat of the hunt, but the slow cadence of shared life. Here, people began to shape not just tools, but relationships. Around these embers, people who had spent their days alone in the woods, on the plains, at the river, returned to one another and found themselves mirrored in their kin. The act of cooking created convergence. It turned isolation into intimacy, and it changed digestion too. The physical act of eating softened with the fire. Meat no longer needed tearing by sheer jaw strength. Roots no longer had to be beaten or chewed for hours. Fire unlocked calories trapped behind fibers and toxins. For hominins living on the edge of energetic collapse, this mattered more than any weapon. It was fire, not flint, that made endurance possible. But cooking also introduced a subtle shift in perception. The raw world was wild, bitter, unpredictable. Cooking made it tame, predictable, shaped by intent. This changed not only the food but the eater. It placed the human in the role of transformer, one who alters the world to fit their needs. And in doing so, it laid the foundations for every act of civilization that would follow. Shared meals came to mean more than hunger. They became cues for cooperation. A roasted bone, passed from one hand to the next, was more than a calorie exchange. It was a symbol of group belonging, of care, of debt, and honor. And slowly, perhaps without realizing it, humans began to cook not only for themselves, but for one another. To anticipate the needs of others, to season stories with their meals. This is where cognition met compassion, where chewing was replaced by choice, where food became a tool not just for the stomach, but for the soul. And the fire, flickering at the heart of every gathering, reminded them survival could be shared, and that shared survival was stronger, because fire did not only cook meat, it cooked meaning, and every ember, every lick of flame, was a whisper of transformation, of what could be changed, of what could be softened, of what could endure through warmth. This was not just the reshaping of meals, it was the reshaping of minds. The cooking hypothesis, born of modern science, but foreshadowed by ancient instinct, suggests that once hominins mastered fire, their brains began to grow, not from magic or mutation, but from energy. Raw food takes time to chew, and time is energy. Raw food fights digestion, and digestion is costly. But cooked food, it surrendered. It gave itself up. It offered its nutrients with grace and speed. And with every fire-softened bite, more calories reached the brain. Those extra calories were not hoarded. They were spent on thought, on memory, on strategy, on the subtle chemistry of cooperation. The frontal lobes, those silent architects of planning and empathy, grew fuller. Neural networks tangled and lit. And over thousands of meals beside thousands of fires, a new kind of thinking emerged. With that thinking came a new kind of seeing. Firelight revealed more than meat and marrow. It made visible the expressions of others, the twitch of an eye, the curve of a smile, the pause before a word. It invited reading between gestures. It allowed for stories to unfold, not just in words, but in tone, in rhythm, in breath. Around the fire, minds became mirrors. Social cognition, the ability to track what others know, feel, or plan, deepened in the glow. Here, not only were calories shared, but attention. Someone watched the fire, someone watched the speaker, someone watched the watcher. It was a dance of minds, choreographed by flickering flame and the primal gravity of a meal. And as language grew, so did memory. Not the cold memory of stone tools and tracks, but the warm memory of lineage and loss. Around the fire, the dead were remembered. Around the fire, the unborn were imagined. Cooking became more than sustenance. It became continuity, a way to carry the past forward, not just in tools or bones, but in tail and tongue. This shift was quiet, but colossal. It meant that food no longer ended with the stomach. It echoed. In song, in symbols, in decisions made days or seasons ahead. And fire, always at the center, made this possible, not just by searing flesh, but by searing patterns into the human heart. Patterns of giving, patterns of gathering, patterns of gazing into flame, and seeing not just warmth, but wisdom passed mouth to mouth, memory to memory, ember to ember. In these patterns, something ancient and tender began to form. A space not just for survival, but for belonging. Because fire did more than cook, it created time. The day no longer ended with darkness. The cold no longer swallowed movement or thought. Around a fire, hours stretched, shadows danced, and with them, stories slow, looping, improvised, and shared, filled the gaps between bites. These stories became a kind of glue, a soft infrastructure of trust that held groups together when the wind howled and the hunger clawed. And it was around these fires, too, that cooperation deepened. Sharing food wasn't always about generosity. Sometimes it was necessity. The carcass of a mammoth couldn't be moved easily or stored safely for one. The reward of a big hunt came with risk. And so it was cooked and consumed together. The effort to obtain it, the hunt, the tracking, the danger was repaid in shared flame. The cook fire was a circle of exchange. Skill traded for sustenance. Patience traded for protection. There is archaeological evidence for communal hearths stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. Charred bones clustered together, repeated layers of ash and burnt sediment. Fire-darkened cave ceilings. These were not random scorchings. These were signatures marks left by people who returned again and again to the same spot, to tend flames that outlived the food they made possible. And with time, fire began to organize space. Hearths divided the sleeping from the waking, the elders from the children, the center from the edge. What was once wild became, in flickering radius, domestic. This was not a house, not yet, but it was the beginning of choosing where and how to stay. A gravity point that pulled the group inward not out of fear, but out of recognition. That recognition had layers. Who stirred the embers, who tended the flame through storm or night, who knew how to place the roots so they would cook evenly, who kept the children back from the heat, who noticed the signs of meat turning or sparks rising too fast. These were small roles, but they added up. In firelight, hierarchy emerged not only from hunting, but from caregiving, patience, and the choreography of cooking. This was the real revolution. Not just the invention of tools or the chase of calories, but the realization that survival could be shared. That warmth was a gift one could give. That food did not need to be eaten in silence or haste. That even in the grip of Ice Age cold, people could create warmth not just around them, but between them. And in that warmth, the brain did something remarkable. It began to reflect. The cooking hypothesis, long debated and often romanticized, proposes that the act of preparing food, especially over fire, radically changed human evolution. Raw meat and tough roots take time to chew, more time to digest. But cooked food softens, breaks down, and delivers energy faster. That energy, saved and redirected, may have helped build the brain. A growing mind is a hungry one. It demands calories, and fire helps supply them. But it wasn't just about fuel. It was about focus. Cooking created waiting. Waiting created attention. Attention created reflection. In the glow of flame, people began to notice things. How meat changed color. How roots smelled sweeter after roasting. How someone else's face flickered in the light. Fire invited not just digestion, but observation, and with that came the slow rise of self-awareness. Shared meals demanded new social skills. You had to read hunger in someone else's eyes, judge fairness in the way a leg bone was passed, interpret mood from silence, memory from gesture. These were not tasks of instinct alone. They were cognitive challenges, and they rewired the brain toward others. The hearth became a stage for empathy, a place to practice theory of mind, to understand that others had thoughts, feelings, fears. You didn't just eat together, you noticed who was missing, who sat farther back, who ate less. These subtle cues became part of survival too. Because in a group where fire was shared, so was emotion. Even the language of food changed. Words for bitter, hot, soft, fresh. These weren't just about preference. They were about safety. Teaching a child which berry would make them sick, or which tuber needed ash roasting first, was a life-saving act. Vocabulary expanded not in the hunt, but in the preparation. Around the fire, people named the world not with roars or shouts, but with caution, curiosity, and care. And over time, cooking reshaped time itself. It allowed for planning. A root buried this morning would be unearthed tomorrow. A carcass cached in the snow would be eaten next week. A fat-rich stew might last a season. This delayed gratification, this ability to imagine the future was a mental leap. It turned instinct into strategy, appetite into patience. So when we say that fire changed us, we are not just speaking of burnt wood and browned meat. We are speaking of a moment when survival and thought fused. When the brain that hunted also began to listen. When the hand that struck flint also stirred embers. When food was not just consumed, but contemplated. And in the flicker of that flame, something ancient awakened the quiet brilliance of minds not only fed, but lit from within. That brilliance would be needed in the final age before everything changed. Before fields were measured, before grain was tamed, before the first fence was ever staked into soil. Because in this final chapter of wild nourishment, there were no crops to count and no harvests to schedule, only the pulse of the earth, the breath of forests, the instincts of gatherers, and the memories of those who read the land like scripture. It was the end of a way of life, but also a culmination, the last full flowering of the forager's mind. As the Ice Age waned, the world reshaped itself. Vast grasslands gave way to swelling forests. Cold steppes softened into patchy woodlands. Where mammoths had trampled, now deer stepped lightly. The giants of the past grew rare, their extinction not sudden, but quietly final, a long goodbye marked by fewer tracks, fewer bones, fewer tales around the fire, and so the diet shifted again. Slowly, subtly. Out of necessity, what was once supplementary became central. Nuts, berries, bird eggs, edible leaves, acorns, pine bark. The old instincts remained honed for scarcity, trained to detect change. But now those instincts guided hands toward different things. The final wild foods were often the quietest ones. Hazelnuts hidden beneath leaf litter, wild onions tucked into wet meadows, fungi blooming in rotting logs, their uses learned through generations of careful taste and careful loss. The bitter and the sweet, the safe and the fatal. This was knowledge that could not be guessed. It had to be remembered, passed down not with words, but gestures, which roots to dig, which leaves to avoid, which berries would numb your tongue or close your throat, and which ones, small, dark, fleeting, meant the difference between hunger and hope. There was no field to tend, no fence to defend. But that did not mean the food came freely. Foragers mapped their world with invisible lines. A good berry ground was not taken lightly. Shellfish beds along the coasts, those, too, were known and revisited, and like all wealth, they invited risk. As groups grew and the land shifted, the boundaries of food became boundaries of belonging. Who could forage here? Who remembered where the tubers sprouted after flood? Who owned the silence of a hill where mushrooms grew? And still, it was not farming. The plants were not bent to the will of humans. Not yet. But humans were bending toward them, watching their cycles, timing their travels, cutting trails that would become seasonal, paths that would someday become roads. But for now, they were still wild, still hunted, still gathered, still earned with every aching joint and frostbitten toe, still remembered with the reverence that only a nearly empty stomach can teach. They had not yet planted, but they had harvested, not from rows, but from memory, not from fields, but from the wide-open page of a world that still wrote its own script. In this twilight era of the forager's world, memory became as vital as fire. One person might remember where the chokecherries ripened first. Another might know the quiet pools where eels gathered after rain. And another still might carry the sacred knowledge of bitter barks that soothed fevers or slowed bleeding. These weren't farmers. They were archivists of the living wild stewards of edible ecosystems they could not claim, only revisit. It was in this remembered rhythm that meals were made, sometimes shared between two families crossing paths at a riverbank, sometimes offered in silence at the edge of a shell midden. These ancient coastal mounds, found from Europe to Australia, were not just garbage heaps. They were layered histories built one meal at a time, over lifetimes. Mussel shells, clam fragments, broken crab claws, all calcified into a record of both abundance and resilience. In some places, the middens grew tall as houses. That's how often they returned. That's how much the sea had given. That's how clearly they marked the seasons not with calendars, but with the patient piling of shells. Further inland, berries spoke a similar language. Blueberries in the highlands, blackberries along the brambles, wild strawberries in disturbed soil. And they too were seasonal signs. When they vanished, it meant movement. To the marshes, to the groves, to the bone-dry ridges where wild seeds rattled in their pods. You didn't just follow food. You followed its absence. And so the post-glacial diet was not a fixed menu. It was a migration through flavors and risks. With every melting glacier came new opportunities and new dangers. Water brought fertility, but also flood. Warmth brought berries, but also insects, disease, and unfamiliar plants that mimicked edible ones with deadly accuracy. The risk of poisoning may have grown even as the threat of starvation faded. For every plant gained, there were new lessons to learn, new mistakes to survive. And amid this evolving landscape, the definition of a meal changed too. It was no longer a single kill shared by all. Now it might be a scattering of edibles, each gathered in solitude, a few nuts, a handful of berries, a tuber roasted quietly in ash, not a feast but a sustenance that invited thought. That made the act of eating a moment of reflection. What have we lost? What have we gained? Where do we go next? What they lost in megafauna, they made up for in nuance. What they lost in weight, they regained in variety. Food was no longer about one big hunt. It became many small successes. A daily game of precision, memory, and gut instinct. And through this shift, the human palate deepened. So did the brain. So did the stories they told about food, not just as fuel, but as knowledge. Not just as taste, but as territory. And that territory was no longer just the mammoth steppe or the glacial valley. It was the forest edge, the estuary mouth, the place where salt met fresh water and reeds whispered of hidden clams. It was the grove where certain mushrooms only rose after the rain, or the clearing where hazelnuts fell in a particular week each autumn. Knowing these places was survival. Remembering them across seasons, across generations, was culture. And slowly, from these remembered harvests, patterns began to form. People returned not just to the same valleys or streams, but to the same groves and marshes year after year. They began to shape the land, not by planting, but by not destroying. They left some roots untouched. They spread the seeds of the sweetest berries along trails. They cleared away brush to let favored plants flourish. This was not yet farming, but it was something in between, a kind of ecological partnership that blurred the line between forager and steward. At the edges of this shift, you could see the contours of something new, a world where food no longer had to be chased, but waited, where the landscape itself could be coaxed, gently, into feeding you not with fences, but with familiarity. These weren't crops, they were kin, and the humans who relied on them did not see themselves as masters of the land, but as guests who had earned the right to return. Still, this way of life had its fragility. A dry year could erase entire berry grounds, a flood could drown the shellfish beds, and as more people learned the paths and secrets of the land, pressure grew. Some places could not carry all who came, some groves stopped giving, Some middens were abandoned, others became contested. And yet, even as change approached, the old knowledge held on. It was carved into memory, into myth, into the very ways people moved through the world. The act of gathering remained a sacred ritual, a way of touching the past, even as the future pressed in. Children still learned which plants to avoid by watching their elders. Stories were still told around the fire of the tree that gave too much, or the one berry that turned bitter when picked too soon. The land still spoke, and those who listened still survived. But the world was shifting, and not just the climate. People began to settle for longer stretches. They built sturdier shelters. They returned to the same places, not just to harvest, but to stay. And in staying, they changed the land and themselves. The final wild harvests were both a memory and a mirror. They showed what was possible without control, what was beautiful without fences, what was lost when food became owned. And yet some echoes remain. In the wild fig that still grows on a stone terrace, in the crabapple tree twisted beside a modern road, in the bitter greens that grow, unnoticed, between the rows of wheat. Remnants, relics, reminders of a time when food was found, not made, and in that world, every bite was earned. Not with coin, not with plough, but with memory, movement, and meaning. Ice Age meals were not things, they were moments. Encounters with the living earth, unpredictable, unrepeatable, and often unrewarded. Yet through these moments, people shaped the rhythms of their days and the architecture of their minds. What they ate shaped how they lived, and what they did not eat, because it was sacred, poisonous, or simply unknown, shaped how they thought. To forage was to interpret. Every plant, every shell, every patch of earth offered a riddle, and each answer was a story passed not in books, but in footsteps, firelight, and fingertips. Even the silence between meals had weight. It taught patience, it taught caution, and above all, it taught respect. The shift to farming dulled some of that sharpness. It brought stability, yes, and abundance, but it narrowed the spectrum of taste and risk. It taught control, not caution. It replaced wonder with yield and hunger with surplus. In this new world, food became predictable. But in that predictability, something vanished. A kind of alertness, a kind of humility. Ice Age eating was not a menu. It was a relationship. Not a recipe, but a ritual. The bitter roots boiled in ash, the cracked femur yielding marrow, the fish smoked above slow coals, the insect hidden in bark, the honey raided from cliffs. These were not just calories, they were codes, keys to survival, yes, but also to identity. And that identity was fluid, shaped by climate, by season, by chance. In one year, a group might live on fish and fungus. In the next, on nuts and bone. There were no guarantees. Only adaptation, only observation, and above all, only each other. Food was shared not just to fill stomachs but to link lives. To feed was to belong, to be fed was to be seen. As farming emerged, so too did hierarchy. The one who owned the field had power. The one who planted the seed decided the meal. But in the forager's world, the giver of food might be anyone or anything. The forest, the river, the insect you didn't squash. Gratitude was not owed to a lord or a law, but to the land itself. And that gratitude was often expressed not with words, but with care, with restraint, with return. This is what the final wild harvests teach us. That food is not only fuel, it is memory, it is meaning. And when we forget where our food comes from, not the supermarket, but the soil, the stream, the sting of the bee, we lose something larger than nutrition. We lose a kind of wisdom, a kind of reverence. And perhaps, in the quietest corners of the earth, that reverence still waits. In a berry bush behind a fence, in a mushroom pushing through concrete, in the hands of a child who doesn't know yet which plants are poison, or which ones once saved us, not just from hunger, but from forgetting who we are. Because food, in the Ice Age, was never merely sustenance. It was memory. It was relationship. It was a thread between the living and the land, between the hunter and the hunted, the gatherer and the gathered, the warmth of the fire and the cold that circled just beyond it. To speak of the final wild harvest is not to mourn its end, but to honor its echo. These were the last meals of a world unbroken, a world where taste came with risk, where fat meant life, and where every bite was a prayer that tomorrow might come. We remember them not because they were exotic, but because they were earned. Dug from frost-bitten soil, stolen from stinging hives, carried across frozen steppes in leather pouches, smoked in caves, buried in pits, fermented under snow. These were not conveniences. They were devotions, proof that to eat was to endure. And in that endurance, we see the shape of a people who did not yet farm, but who knew what it meant to care for the land, not with ploughs and fences, but with footsteps and patience, who took only what they could name, who shared what they could not finish, who fed one another not for profit, but because they were alive. Together, what we lost in the turn toward agriculture was not just variety, but a way of being, a way of knowing, a way of listening. When we stopped hunting, we lost the silence. When we stopped gathering, we lost the gratitude. When we stopped sharing fires beneath the open sky, we lost the stories that rose with the smoke, but not entirely, because some part of us still remembers. In the bite of wild fruit, in the pull toward rivers, in the stillness before a meal, we may no longer eat like Ice Age humans, but we still hunger like them for meaning, for memory, for something real, and perhaps that is the final gift of their forgotten foods, not the recipes, but the reverence. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for walking this long road through the ashes and ice of prehistory, piecing together the final wild harvest before farming began. If this story brought you even a flicker of wonder, a quiet moment of warmth, or a new way of seeing what food once meant, then your presence here has already mattered more than you know. Perhaps a single moment stayed with you. The crack of marrow bones, a fire beneath root and stone, a quiet feast where meat became myth. Whether it was the image of marrow glistening in a split femur, the hiss of roasted tubers in ash, or the hush of snowbanks hiding meat like memory. These fragments are what connect us, echoes of how we once ate and how we survived. If a single flavor, moment, or memory stood out to you, I'd love to hear it. Leave it in the comments as a quiet offering to the circle we're building here. And if you wish to follow more trails into the deep time of our species past the frost, the flame, and the forgotten meals, you know what to do. Like, share, or subscribe to stay close to the fire. Until then, stay curious, stay thoughtful,